Imagine waking up in a cold stone house, the faint light of dawn slipping through wooden shutters. The fire in the hearth has nearly gone out, and your stomach is already growling. You're living in the Middle Ages, and breakfast, if it even exists at all, is going to look nothing like what you know today. No steaming mugs of coffee, no plates stacked with pancakes, no sugary cereals waiting in a box. Instead, what greeted people in the morning depended on who they were, where they lived, and whether or not they were lucky enough to have food at all. In this video, we're going to journey back through time and uncover the surprising and sometimes strange world of medieval breakfast. From peasants who often skipped the morning meal altogether, to nobles who dined on bread, ale, and even leftover meat, breakfast in the Middle Ages was a reflection of class, culture, and survival. Along the way, we'll also explore the rituals, beliefs, and traditions tied to food in the morning hours, because breakfast wasn't just about eating. It was also about religion, health, and daily routine. This is History for Sleep, where we bring you long, calming stories from the past, designed to help you drift off into peaceful rest. If you enjoy relaxing history told in a soothing way, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a new video. And in the comments, let us know what time you usually listen. Do you drift off right at bedtime? Or do you use these stories to wind down during the day? Also, tell us what parts of history you'd like us to cover next. We love shaping these journeys with your ideas. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin our journey into the kitchens, monasteries, taverns, and homes of the medieval world as we uncover what breakfast really looked like in the Middle Ages. And more. When we imagine breakfast today, most of us think of it as a given part of our daily routine. It is the meal that greets us in the morning, the one that supposedly fuels our day. Whether it is a quick bite of toast before heading out to work, or a slow ritual of coffee, fruit, and something warm to eat. Modern culture has drilled into us the idea that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, a phrase we have all heard countless times. But in the Middle Ages, the story was far more complicated. Breakfast was not always seen as necessary, and for many, it was not even recognized as a proper meal at all. The way medieval people thought about food in the morning tells us much about their daily lives, their beliefs, and their struggles. In the early medieval period, the concept of a structured day with 3 meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, was not yet fixed in place. Instead, meals were irregular, shaped by the rhythms of work, the turning of the seasons, and above all, by religious obligations. The Christian Church played an enormous role in shaping how people thought about food. Fasting was considered virtuous, and to eat too early in the day could be seen as a sign of greed, gluttony, or weakness. The body was expected to endure hunger with patience as part of spiritual discipline. This meant that for many centuries, especially in the early Middle Ages, eating in the morning was something that carried a faint air of suspicion. It was permitted, of course, but it was not celebrated the way modern society celebrates a hearty breakfast. For peasants, who made up the majority of medieval Europe, the idea of breakfast was simple. If food was available, it might be eaten, but the day's work usually began before any thought of a meal. The rhythm of peasant life was dictated by daylight. At first light, men and women alike were expected to be active, whether tending fields, caring for animals, fetching water, or beginning a trade. Often, there was no pause to eat until the day was already well underway. A farmer might begin plowing at sunrise and only later. After hours of labor, stop to chew on a hunk of coarse bread or sip from a mug of watered ale. This was not a structured breakfast in the way we imagine it. It was more a matter of staving off hunger when it became unavoidable. Among the upper classes, attitudes were more flexible. Nobles were not bound by the same relentless cycle of labor, and they could afford to indulge in food more often. But even in aristocratic households, breakfast was not always considered a necessary daily practice. Instead, what we might call breakfast was often a light refreshment taken when desired. A slice of bread, a bit of cheese, perhaps a cup of wine or ale. In the courts of kings and lords, a morning meal might be more elaborate, especially when guests were present, but it was rarely as formalized as the feasts held later in the day. The suspicion toward breakfast was rooted in more than just custom. Religious writers often warned against the dangers of eating too early. The medieval church believed that gluttony was one of the 7 deadly sins, and gluttony was defined not only as eating too much, but as eating too eagerly or at the wrong time. To eat before the appointed hour of the day could therefore be considered morally questionable. Monks, for example, often fasted until mid-morning, breaking their fast only after completing long hours of prayer and work. Their example influenced broader society, reinforcing the idea that self-control in the morning was a sign of virtue. Yet for all these rules and warnings, human hunger is persistent. People cannot simply will it away. For this reason, breakfast, in one form or another, did exist in every stratum of medieval society. The difference lay in how it was spoken about, and in how much emphasis was placed upon it. Among the poor, it was often unacknowledged, taken in bits and pieces when food was available. Among the wealthy, it was less about survival and more about preference, and thus could be shaped into a habit, though one not always praised. The foods that appeared at breakfast were rarely elaborate. Bread was by far the most common element. Thick, dark loaves made from rye or barley, or lighter wheat bread for those who could afford it, formed the foundation of nearly every meal in the Middle Ages. In the morning, this bread might be eaten plain, dipped into ale, or spread with butter or cheese. Ale itself was a central part of breakfast for many. Because water supplies could be unsafe, even children were given small beer. A weak, lightly fermented ale that was more nourishing than plain water. This drink was consumed at nearly every meal, including the earliest one of the day. To a medieval person, the sight of someone sipping ale at dawn would not have seemed strange. It was entirely ordinary. In wealthier households, other foods might be added: eggs, cold meats, or leftover dishes from the night before. Leftovers were especially common, since medieval kitchens had no reliable way to preserve food for long. What had been roasted or boiled the previous evening might be eaten the next morning, especially in households where waste was frowned upon. Sweet foods were rare, but sometimes honey or fruit might appear on the table, offering a touch of variety to the otherwise plain fare. Spices, expensive and imported from distant lands, were the mark of wealth. A nobleman might sip a cup of spiced wine upon waking, while a peasant would have nothing of the sort. It is important to remember that the medieval day did not always begin at the same time for everyone. In an age before alarm clocks and electric lights, sunrise dictated the schedule. In winter, mornings were dark and slow to arrive, and people might delay their work, whereas in summer, the day began much earlier. This shifting pattern also shaped breakfast. A farmer rising in July might be hungry enough to nibble on bread before heading into the fields, while in January, the long night might end with a slow, fire-lit start, leaving breakfast until later. Seasonal rhythms played as much a role as social custom. What strikes us when we look closely at medieval attitudes toward breakfast is how fluid and flexible they were. There was no single, universal idea of what breakfast should be. For some, it was a small bite before work. For others, it was an indulgence frowned upon by moralists. For others still, it was a necessity for health or labor. The very word breakfast, meaning to break the night's fast, did not become common in English until later centuries. In the Middle Ages, people were simply eating when they needed to, and naming it was less important than enduring hunger or finding nourishment. Over time, however, the morning meal became more accepted. By the later Middle Ages, especially in towns and cities, breakfast was increasingly seen as an ordinary part of life. Merchants preparing for a long day of trade, students setting out for lessons, even craftsmen heading to their workshops. Many of them began to eat in the morning as a matter of course. This shift reflected not only practical needs, but also a gradual loosening of the strict moral rules about food. The medieval world was not static, and attitudes toward eating, even something as simple as breakfast, evolved along with broader changes in society. So when we ask, did medieval people eat breakfast? The answer is both yes and no. Yes, they ate in the morning, often in small, simple ways. But no, they did not regard breakfast as we do, as an essential daily meal. It was something optional, something shaped by necessity more than by routine, and something tinged with moral judgment. To us, skipping breakfast might seem unusual or even unhealthy, but to them, it was often the norm. Their world revolved less around the clock and more around the demands of survival, the expectations of faith, and the availability of food. And so, the idea of breakfast in medieval Europe was not one of pancakes and eggs, but one of bread crusts, ale mugs, and the constant negotiation between hunger and restraint. It was not the cheerful, celebrated morning ritual we imagine today, but a quiet, uncertain space between fasting and feasting, survival and indulgence. It was, like so much else in the Middle Ages, a matter of balance between body and soul. To step into the life of a medieval peasant is to step into a world where every hour of the day was claimed by necessity. The morning did not begin with a choice of what to eat, or whether one wanted coffee or tea, but with the sound of roosters crowing, the chill of damp air, and the pressing awareness of duties waiting outside. For the men and women who worked the land, the day was a cycle of unending labor, and food was only one piece of survival. Breakfast, as we think of it, was not a meal laid out at leisure, but a question of what scraps might be at hand, and whether there was time to stop and eat at all. Most peasants lived in simple houses made of timber, wattle, and daub, with thatched roofs and a single smoky hearth at the center. These homes were not warm or spacious, but functional, built to shelter families and sometimes animals during harsh seasons. At dawn, the hearth fire often had to be coaxed back to life from faint embers. If there was a pot hanging above it, it might still hold the remains of last night's pottage, the vegetable and grain stew that was a daily staple. That pot, bubbling quietly when fuel could be spared, was often the only source of food available in the early hours. A ladle of thickened broth with bits of barley, onions, cabbage, or perhaps a sliver of bacon if fortune had been kind, might serve as the first nourishment of the day. But more often, the morning began with nothing. Work could not wait for a meal. Men might head into the fields before eating, and women might begin their tasks of tending animals, spinning, fetching water, or kneading bread without a bite to sustain them. The hunger of the early hours was something endured, not avoided. Peasants were accustomed to living on little, and they accepted hunger as part of their lot in life. They were not strangers to gnawing stomachs. To them, it was simply the way the day began. When food was available, it was usually simple. A hunk of coarse rye bread, sometimes stale from days past, dipped into a mug of ale. Ale was the one reliable source of calories and liquid nourishment. Brewed at home or locally, it was weak in alcohol, but filling enough to give some energy. Even children drank it, and in the morning it was often the first thing consumed, sipped quickly before heading out to toil. Cheese, when available, might be added a small piece made from the family's cow or goat, salted to last longer. Butter was rarer but treasured, a rich spread that could make a rough piece of bread more palatable. Yet this was not a guaranteed start to the day. If harvests had been poor, if supplies were low, or if debts demanded that food be sold rather than eaten, then breakfast vanished altogether. Peasants often worked until midday before receiving their first true meal, one substantial enough to restore strength. Until then, they pressed forward through hunger. Children sometimes went without too, their first bites not coming until later in the day. Hunger was not considered unusual. It was a companion that followed most families, especially through the long winters. Life for the peasant was shaped by the seasons. In summer, work began earlier, and the appetite stirred quickly under the strain of plowing or harvesting. A small piece of bread at dawn might be a mercy before long hours beneath the sun. In winter, mornings were darker, slower, and colder, and people might delay eating simply because fuel was too precious to waste on early cooking. The body learned to adapt to this rhythm, to expect little in the way of early sustenance. The moral tone of the age also shaped the peasant's breakfast, or lack of it. The church's influence reached into every household, no matter how poor. To eat too early could be seen as indulgence, and indulgence was frowned upon. A family that delayed their first meal until after morning prayers or after the first tasks of the day might have felt they were behaving more properly, more piously. Even if hunger was pressing, there was virtue in waiting. This was especially true during periods of fasting, when even the smallest morning bite might feel like a failure of discipline. Despite these restrictions, necessity often won. A man facing a full day of back-breaking work with plow or scythe could hardly be expected to labor with no food at all. Records from manorial courts and accounts from observers sometimes mention laborers receiving bread and ale early in the day, not as a luxury, but as a practical allowance to keep them standing. Lords who expected their tenants to work long hours in their fields sometimes provided a morning ration, ensuring that exhaustion would not halt productivity. In this way, breakfast crept into the lives of peasants, less by choice than by necessity. Still, the simplicity of their fare is striking when compared to our modern expectations. There were no eggs sizzling in pans, no fruit laid neatly on platters, no porridge sweetened with sugar. A peasant's breakfast, when it existed, was rough, dry, and sometimes unappetizing. Bread was coarse and heavy, often baked with bran or ground peas, mixed into the flour to stretch it further. It could be hard on the teeth, especially when old. Ale was flat and cloudy, but safe to drink, and it filled the belly enough to carry one forward. Sometimes a spoonful of pottage or a crust dipped in broth added variety, but there was little more to be expected. For children, the morning was no kinder. They might be given a watered-down version of what their parents drank, or a spoonful of porridge if grains were available. Milk, when cows or goats produced it, might be spared for them, though milk was often more valuable when churned into butter or made into cheese. Childhood hunger was common, and even the youngest were expected to endure it. The emptiness of the peasant's morning shaped their bodies and their days. Hunger made them lean and hardened, able to work long hours with little fuel. But it also wore them down over time, making illness more dangerous, recovery more difficult. Malnutrition was always near, and the lack of a solid morning meal contributed to lives that were shorter and more fragile than our own. Yet within that hardship, there was resilience. The peasant's body, accustomed to scarcity, learned to endure what would seem unbearable to us. It is easy, from our perspective, to see the peasant's morning as bleak, but to them it was simply life. The sound of animals stirring, the weight of a plow handle, the damp earth beneath their feet, these things mattered more than whether a piece of bread was eaten at sunrise or at noon. Hunger was a companion, yes, but so was survival, and survival meant carrying on regardless. A crust of bread, dipped in ale, snatched between chores, might be enough to quiet the stomach and press forward. That was breakfast, when it existed, for the medieval peasant. Over centuries, this pattern of skipping or minimizing breakfast would slowly begin to change, influenced by shifting ideas of health, labor, and piety. But in the heart of the Middle Ages, for the common people who worked the land, the morning was not about feasting. It was about enduring, about beginning the day with strength drawn not from food, but from necessity. Their mornings were empty, yet filled with the unending demands of life. And in that emptiness, a kind of strength was forged. the quiet resilience of those who labored without complaint, through hunger and hardship alike. If we were to step into a medieval village in the early hours of the day and ask what people ate most often at breakfast, the answer would almost always be the same: bread, ale, and cheese. These were the staples, the foods so common and dependable that they became part of nearly every meal. They were the foundation upon which the diets of peasants, townsfolk, and even many nobles rested. And while we might think of such a simple combination as meager, in the Middle Ages it was the backbone of survival, the quiet companions of daily life, and the taste of home to countless men, women, and children. Bread was the heart of it all. It was not simply food, but a symbol of sustenance itself. In medieval Europe, to have bread was to live, and to be without it was to face hunger. The loaves of the common people were not the soft, fluffy breads we know today, but heavy and coarse, often dark in color and dense in texture. Made from rye, barley, or oats, and sometimes mixed with peas, beans, or even ground acorns in times of scarcity, these breads were filling and practical. Wheat, the grain most prized for its lightness and sweetness, was expensive and reserved for the wealthy. For the common villager, bread was a daily necessity, but not a luxury. It was baked in round or oblong loaves, often in communal ovens where entire villages brought their dough to be baked at once. The smell of bread baking was one of the few daily comforts, drifting across streets and fields, promising nourishment. In the morning, bread might be eaten alone, a slice torn from a loaf and chewed slowly, or dipped into ale to soften it. Sometimes it was spread with butter, though butter was precious and not always available. Cheese could also be paired with it, made from the milk of cows, goats, or sheep, depending on the region. Cheese was a way of preserving milk, and it varied in quality and texture. Fresh cheeses were soft and eaten quickly, while harder cheeses could last longer and travel farther. To a commoner, a chunk of bread with a piece of cheese was not just breakfast, but also lunch, supper, or a snack between tasks. It was versatile, filling, and within reach of most households that owned even a single animal for milk. And then there was ale, the ever-present drink of the medieval world. Unlike the strong beers of later centuries, the ale of the Middle Ages was weak, only lightly fermented, and often consumed in large quantities. Known as small beer, it had just enough alcohol to make it safer than water, which was often contaminated. For this reason, everyone drank it: men, women, children, and even the elderly. In the morning, a cup of ale was as ordinary as a glass of water is today. It washed down the bread, filled the stomach, and provided a modest amount of energy. In some ways, it was the medieval equivalent of morning coffee, a beverage that accompanied the start of the day and was woven into the rhythm of life. Together, bread, ale, and cheese formed a triad of sustenance that could be found in nearly every village and town. They were not glamorous, but they were dependable. A peasant rising before dawn to work the fields might grab a chunk of yesterday's loaf and a mug of ale before heading out. A child might nibble on a piece of cheese while watching over animals. A craftsman beginning his day in a workshop might pause for bread dipped into ale, eaten with rough hands between tasks. These were ordinary moments, repeated day after day, anchoring people to the earth and to one another. What is striking is how central these foods were across all levels of society, though the quality differed. The bread of the wealthy, made from fine white wheat, was soft and delicate, while that of the poor was rough and dark. The cheese of nobles might be flavored with herbs or made from rich, creamy milk, while the cheese of peasants was simpler and saltier. The ale served in noble halls might be clearer and stronger, while that of the village was cloudy and weak. Yet in essence, the foods were the same, shared across class lines, uniting people in their dependence upon the basics. These staples were not only food, but also symbols. Bread, in particular, carried deep religious meaning. In Christian Europe, Bread was tied to the body of Christ in the Eucharist, and to break bread was both a literal and spiritual act. To be without bread was to suffer both physically and symbolically. It is no wonder that during times of famine, when grain failed and bread grew scarce, fear and despair spread swiftly. Bread riots erupted in towns when bakers were accused of hoarding grain or raising prices unfairly. For people who lived so close to hunger, the security of bread was essential to peace of mind. The routines around these staples varied, depending on the season and availability. In harvest times, bread was abundant, freshly baked and eaten with relief. In lean winters, loaves might be stretched thin, slices rationed carefully to last until spring. Cheese, too, had its cycles, plentiful in summer when milk flowed, but harder to come by in winter when animals produced less. Ale was more constant, though it required grain to brew, and shortages in crops could affect even this most basic drink. People adapted as best they could, but the fragility of their food supply was always felt. Despite the simplicity, there was comfort in these foods. Bread fresh from the oven, even coarse and heavy, was warming. Cheese provided strength, and ale quenched thirst in a way water could not. Families shared these foods together, tearing bread into pieces and passing mugs around. The rituals of eating were as much about community as about sustenance. To share bread and ale with neighbors was to affirm bonds of trust and fellowship. To share cheese was to share the product of one's animals and labor, a small but meaningful gesture of generosity. We might look at such a breakfast and think it poor, but to a medieval villager, it was the ordinary fabric of life. It was not meant to delight the senses, but to fill the belly. In the morning quiet, before long hours of work, a simple piece of bread and cheese, washed down with ale, was enough to carry a person forward. The very simplicity made it reliable, and reliability was worth more than luxury in a world where scarcity was never far away. Over time, these staples would remain at the center of European diets, even as new foods and flavors arrived from distant lands. But in the Middle Ages, they were not just staples. They were survival itself. Bread, ale, and cheese, plain, humble, and enduring, were the unchanging companions of the medieval morning, binding rich and poor alike in the shared rhythms of hunger and relief. If the life of a peasant was marked by scarcity and the constant pressure of work, the life of a noble offered a different kind of rhythm, and nowhere was this more visible than at the table. For nobles, the morning could be a time of indulgence, or it could be a time of restraint, depending on the customs of the household, the season, or the expectations of religion. Unlike the laborers who trudged into fields before tasting so much as a crumb of bread, the nobility had the privilege of choice. What a noble ate upon rising was not dictated by hunger alone, but by preference, ritual, and the weight of tradition. In the great halls of castles and manor houses, mornings began slowly compared to the hurried dawns of the peasantry. Fires were tended by servants, rooms were aired, and noble families stirred from their chambers to face the day. For some, there was no breakfast at all, in keeping with the older suspicion toward morning meals. A goblet of watered wine or ale might be taken to ease thirst, but nothing more. For others, especially in later centuries, the morning became a time for small luxuries, foods that peasants could never dream of tasting, but which to nobles were part of the daily order of life. One of the most common options was bread, but unlike the dense, dark loaves of the common people, the bread of the wealthy was made from fine white wheat flour, sieved and sifted to create soft, pale loaves that were lighter in texture and sweeter to the taste. This bread was called manchet in England, and it was a symbol of status, for only those who could afford the best wheat could eat it daily. To begin the day with such bread was not simply to fill the belly, it was to demonstrate one's wealth and refinement. Alongside bread, nobles often consumed cheese and butter, but again, theirs was of a different quality than the rougher dairy of peasants. Rich, creamy cheeses flavored with herbs, or butter churned from the milk of well-kept herds, offered a depth of flavor and nourishment far beyond what ordinary villagers could obtain. Eggs were another common feature, gathered fresh from the henhouses kept within castle walls or manor estates. Fried, boiled, or baked into pastries, eggs were versatile and abundant enough to appear often at the noble breakfast table. Cold meats were also popular, especially leftovers from the previous evening's feast. A noble's dinner could include roasted venison, pork, or poultry, and what remained was not wasted. Slices of meat, sometimes spiced or salted, were eaten the next morning, offering a hearty beginning to the day. Fish, too, was common, especially in regions near rivers, coasts, or lakes. Smoked or salted fish kept well, and its presence at the morning table signaled both wealth and variety. Perhaps most striking were the beverages. While peasants drank weak ale as a necessity, nobles might sip on wine, often imported from vineyards in France, Italy, or Spain. For those who desired more, wines might be mulled with spices such as cinnamon, cloves, or nutmeg, which were costly imports carried along long trade routes from the East. To drink spiced wine in the morning was not only a pleasure, but also a statement of status, showing that one's household had access to the rare and exotic. On feast days or when entertaining guests, noble breakfasts could be expanded into something approaching a banquet. Platters of pastries filled with fruits or meats, stews rich with herbs, or even sweetened dishes made with honey or imported sugar might appear. Sugar in particular was a rare treasure, as it was expensive and difficult to obtain, yet it found its way into noble kitchens and onto their morning tables. To eat something sweet at dawn was a true luxury, one far beyond the reach of ordinary folk. But not all noble mornings were marked by such indulgence. Many aristocrats adhered to the church's warnings about gluttony and refrained from eating too early. A light refreshment might be taken, but the main meal was often reserved for midday, after prayers and duties had been attended to. This was especially true during times of fasting or on days of religious observance, when even the wealthiest refrained from indulgence in the morning. In such times, the noble household mirrored the restraint of the monastery, though with more comfort and less severity. The experience of breakfast for nobles also depended heavily on travel and circumstance. A lord or lady on the road, moving between estates or traveling to court, might eat in inns or private chambers, taking whatever was available. In such moments, breakfast could look surprisingly similar to that of the peasant bread: cheese, ale, and perhaps a piece of fruit. The difference lay not in the food itself, but in the context, for nobles could choose to step down to this simplicity, while peasants had no choice at all. Servants played an important role in preparing and presenting the morning meal. In great households, entire staffs were dedicated to food, from bakers to brewers, dairymaids to cooks. A noble family might never touch the preparation of their own breakfast, receiving it instead on platters or trays carried by retainers. In this way, the act of eating in the morning was not only about sustenance, but also about hierarchy and the display of wealth. To sit at a table laid with fine bread, rich cheese, cold meats, and spiced wine, served by attentive hands, was to affirm one's place in the order of society. It is worth noting that breakfast customs were not uniform across Europe. In France, for example, wine and bread were common even in the morning, while in England, ale and meat were favored. In Italy and Spain, fruits, olive oil, and lighter fare sometimes appeared on noble tables, reflecting the different climates and agricultural traditions. Yet across all these regions, the same themes persisted: abundance, choice, and the quiet tension between indulgence and restraint. We might imagine the atmosphere of a noble breakfast as calm, the flickering of candles or hearth fires lighting the hall, servants moving quietly, the clink of goblets, the soft murmur of voices. It was a world apart from the harsh dawn of the peasant, where hunger drove men into the fields before they could eat. For the nobility, Breakfast was less about necessity and more about preference, less about survival and more about enjoyment. It was a reflection of status, a moment in which wealth could be tasted and displayed. Still, it was not always lavish. For every feast-like spread, there were mornings of simplicity, when only a cup of wine and a slice of bread were taken before the day began. This duality captures the essence of the noble breakfast, at times modest, at times extravagant, always touched by the ability to choose. And in that choice lay the true difference between the noble and the peasant. One endured hunger because there was no alternative. The other could embrace simplicity or luxury as mood and circumstance dictated. So the noble table at dawn was a place of contrasts between plain bread and spiced wine, between restraint and indulgence, between necessity and display. It was not the same every day, nor for every noble, but it was always a reflection of privilege. To sit down in the morning with white bread, fine cheese, cold meats, and sweetened wine was to be reminded that one lived above the struggles of the majority. And yet, even in these halls of abundance, the echoes of the church's warnings and the rhythms of tradition kept the breakfast from becoming the grand affair it would later become. It was, instead, a moment balanced between the old suspicion of early eating and the pleasures of wealth, a glimpse into the unique world of noble mornings in the Middle Ages. To understand medieval life fully, one must step inside the monastery, for these sacred walls shaped not only religion, but also the habits and rhythms of everyday people. The monasteries of the Middle Ages were more than houses of prayer. They were centers of learning, keepers of knowledge, and models of discipline. Within them, daily life unfolded according to strict rules, rules that reached into every detail, even down to the simple act of when and what to eat. And in the morning, these rules often meant that breakfast was not only delayed, but deliberately restrained, an act of devotion as much as one of nourishment. When the bell rang in the early hours before dawn, monks rose from their hard wooden beds or straw pallets and entered the chapel for prayer. This was the beginning of the canonical hours, a cycle of worship that marked the entire day. Before the sun had fully risen, monks might already have sung hymns, recited psalms, and bowed in silence. Food did not accompany these rituals. Hunger was expected to be endured patiently as part of spiritual training. To eat before prayer was to put the body before the soul, and such a reversal of order was not tolerated. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided countless monasteries across Europe, was clear in its structure. Meals were fixed times of communal life, taken together in silence, with scripture read aloud as monks ate. Breakfast, as we understand it, was not recognized. Instead, there was the main meal of the day, usually at midday, and a lighter one in the evening. Monks broke their nightly fast not in the early hours, but only after prayers and work had already been completed. The absence of breakfast was not considered a hardship, but a discipline, a way of training the spirit to rule the body. Yet even in these strict settings, hunger had to be acknowledged. Monks, like peasants and nobles, needed fuel to carry out their duties. The monastery was not only a place of prayer, but also of labor. Fields needed tending, manuscripts needed copying, buildings needed repair. To expect men to work without sustenance at all was unrealistic. And so, exceptions developed. In some monasteries, particularly in colder regions or during times of intense labor, a small refreshment was permitted in the morning. This was not called breakfast, but it served a similar purpose. A piece of bread, a sip of watered wine, or a bit of weak ale might be given, enough to quiet hunger without indulging it. The foods available to monks reflected their vows of simplicity. Meat from four-legged animals was forbidden under Benedict's rule, though fish and poultry were sometimes allowed, and certainly vegetables, grains, and dairy formed the heart of monastic meals. In the morning, when something was permitted, it was nearly always plain. Coarse bread, perhaps softened with milk, or a bowl of thin pottage. Ale was common, brewed within the monastery itself, and sometimes flavored lightly with herbs for medicinal purposes. Cheese or butter might appear when the dairy herd allowed it. These were not feasts, but sustenance taken under the watchful eye of discipline. The silence of the refectory added to the solemnity of eating. A monk did not chatter or laugh over his morning bread. He sat quietly, bowed his head, and listened as passages of Scripture were read aloud. Eating was not a pleasure, but a continuation of worship. Even the act of chewing and swallowing was to be done mindfully, with gratitude and humility. To indulge in food was to fall into sin. To eat with restraint was to imitate Christ. In this way, even the smallest morning bite became a spiritual act. For the laity outside monastery walls, these habits carried weight. Monks were regarded as models of virtue, and their restraint at the table influenced how ordinary people thought about food. If monks could endure the morning hours without a meal, perhaps so should others. The suspicion of breakfast that lingered in medieval society found strong reinforcement in the example of monasteries. Even nobles, who could afford fine spreads in the morning, often hesitated, reminded of the virtue of fasting by the very presence of these cloistered men. But monasteries were not monolithic. Customs varied from place to place. Some houses, especially those in harsher climates, bent the rules to suit survival. Others were stricter, enforcing fasts even when health suffered. Historical records tell of debates within orders about how much food was necessary and when it should be given. The mendicant friars, who lived among the people in towns and cities, sometimes adopted different customs than cloistered monks. Each community balanced discipline with mercy in its own way, but all shared the conviction that food was not simply nourishment, it was part of spiritual life. Imagine the rhythm of a monastic morning. The bell echoes through stone halls. Sandaled feet shuffle across cold floors toward the chapel. Chanting fills the air, deep voices rising and falling in unison. The sun has not yet risen fully, yet hours of prayer have already been offered. Only after this, perhaps, does a monk take a small cup of ale or a piece of bread, breaking his fast not with indulgence, but with necessity. Then tools are taken up, hoes in the garden, quills in the scriptorium, hammers in the workshop. The body works as the spirit prays, and the hunger of the morning becomes part of the discipline of devotion. In this, the monastic approach to breakfast reveals something larger about the medieval worldview. Life was not about comfort or indulgence, but about order, faith, and endurance. To resist hunger was to share in Christ's suffering. To delay food was to elevate the soul above the body. Even when food was given, it was never separated from prayer. In monasteries, there was no such thing as a casual snack, no thoughtless bite on the way to work. Every crumb was part of a greater pattern, a greater act of worship. Over the centuries, monasteries adapted. As Europe changed, so did the rules about food. By the later Middle Ages, many houses had grown wealthy, their tables more abundant, their rules more flexible. Critics complained of monks feasting on fish, cheese, and wine, living in comfort rather than poverty. Yet even then, the morning remained a time of restraint. The tradition of fasting before noon endured, shaping not only monastic life, but also the culture of the wider world. The echoes of this discipline can still be felt today. The very word breakfast reminds us of the fast that once extended through the morning. To break the fast was not to rush to the table upon waking, but to wait, to endure, and then to eat with gratitude. The monasteries of the Middle Ages may be long gone, their refectories silent, and their bells no longer heard, but the memory of their rhythms remains. In the way we speak of food, in the way we think about hunger and restraint, the shadow of monastic mornings lingers. And so, in the cloistered halls of medieval monasteries, breakfast was never just about food. It was about faith, discipline, and the training of the soul. It was about learning to wait, to endure, to pray before eating, and to see nourishment not as a right, but as a gift. To the monks, the morning was not a time of indulgence, but a time of sacrifice. And through their example, they shaped the way generations of men and women thought about the simple act of eating at dawn. The medieval world was not a place of easy journeys. Roads were rough, often little more than dirt tracks carved by carts and hooves. Bridges were scarce, rivers were forded when possible, and forests stretched long and dark between settlements. Yet people traveled. Merchants moved their goods from town to town. Messengers carried letters for kings and lords. Craftsmen sought work in new places, and pilgrims walked across countries, sometimes across continents, in search of holy shrines. For these travelers, the question of food in the morning was not one of choice, but of necessity. To rise with the sun and face the road ahead meant needing something to steady the body. And while the noble in his hall, or the monk in his cloister, might debate the virtue of eating at dawn, the traveler's morning was far more practical. Imagine a pilgrim rising before daylight, packed tightly into the corner of a crowded inn, or lying on the straw of a hospitable farmhouse. The air is cold, the body stiff from yesterday's long walk, and the miles ahead loom large. To begin such a day on an empty stomach would be a hardship indeed. And so, pilgrims and travelers sought what little food could be found at dawn. This breakfast was rarely elaborate, but it was enough to keep feet moving along the dusty road. Inns and taverns played a crucial role. Scattered along trade routes and near towns, these establishments offered food and drink to those passing by. A traveler might be served a slice of coarse bread, a wedge of cheese, and a mug of ale before setting out. It was not a feast, but it was filling enough to carry someone until the next village. In wealthier inns, particularly those near bustling cities, breakfast could be more generous. Eggs fried or boiled, perhaps some cold meat left from the evening before, and occasionally dried fruits or nuts. The quality of such meals varied widely, depending on the innkeeper's generosity, the traveler's purse, and the supplies on hand. Pilgrims, who often traveled with little money, relied more on charity. Along pilgrimage routes, monasteries and churches sometimes offered food to those on the road. Bread and ale were the most common gifts, easy to provide in small amounts. Some shrines became known for their hospitality, welcoming weary walkers with warm pottage or simple fare in the morning. Yet many pilgrims had to depend on what they carried with them. A pouch of dried bread, a lump of cheese, or a flask of ale tucked into a pack might serve as breakfast, eaten quickly as the sun rose and the road beckoned once more. For the wealthy who traveled with retinues, the experience was different. Nobles on the road did not rely on the generosity of taverns or monasteries. They brought their kitchens with them, in the form of cooks, servants, and supplies carried by cart or pack-horse. Their mornings might include fresh bread baked along the way, meats roasted the night before, or delicacies purchased in markets of towns they passed through. For these travelers, breakfast could resemble the tables of their own halls, though adapted for the road. Yet even here, practicality intervened. Travel was uncomfortable, and meals were often taken quickly, without the ceremony of home. The rhythm of travel shaped the timing of food. Most journeys began at dawn, when the light was fresh and the day's miles lay ahead. A heavy meal at that hour could slow the body, so breakfasts were often lighter, meant only to sustain rather than to satisfy. The main meal came later, at midday, when the sun was high and rest was needed. Breakfast was but the first step, a small nourishment to launch the traveler forward. The foods themselves carried the flavors of the road. Bread, once again, was ever present, but now it was often stale from days of carrying, hard, and in need of softening in ale or broth. Cheese, salted and firm, was well suited for journeys, lasting longer without spoiling. Dried fish, especially herring or cod, was a common companion, its saltiness both a preservative and a challenge to thirsty mouths. Nuts and dried fruits, when available, provided easy energy. though they were more often found in the packs of wealthier travelers than in those of poor pilgrims. The experience of eating on the road was far different from the comfort of home. Meals were taken on the ground, seated on rocks or grass, or within the smoky air of a crowded inn. There were no fine platters, no servants to pour wine in silver goblets. A wooden bowl, a simple knife, and a rough mug were all that was needed. The act of eating was not ceremonial, but practical, meant to keep one moving. And yet, even here, moments of fellowship emerged. Pilgrims shared their bread with one another, strangers exchanged mugs of ale, and laughter sometimes rose from tired throats as people rested together. For the devout pilgrim, breakfast could carry spiritual meaning. The hunger endured on the road was seen as part of the sacrifice, a reflection of the journey's purpose. To eat sparingly in the morning was to align oneself with the discipline of saints, to share in the hardship of the holy path. Many pilgrims accepted their meager breakfasts as a form of devotion, thanking God for whatever morsel was granted and offering their hunger as part of their prayer. For merchants, on the other hand, breakfast was purely practical. A merchant setting out with goods needed to ensure his strength, for the day might bring haggling, long rides, or dangers along the way. Bread and cheese were common companions, but in towns, merchants could often afford better: sweet rolls, fried pastries, or fruit purchased from local markets. These richer foods were not everyday fare, but for those who could afford them, they brightened the mornings of travel. The life of the soldier on the road brought yet another variation. Armies on campaign rose early, often before the sun, and food was rationed according to what supplies were carried. Bread, salted meat, and ale once again formed the staples, handed out by quartermasters or taken from the spoils of surrounding lands. Soldiers might eat quickly before marching, their breakfasts consumed in the company of comrades, weapons always at hand. For them, breakfast was not about comfort, but about strength and survival, a fuel for the long marches and battles that awaited. Despite all these variations, a common thread runs through the traveler's breakfast: simplicity, practicality, and dependence on staples. Whether pilgrim or noble, merchant or soldier, the morning meal on the road was rarely elaborate. It was shaped by the demands of movement, the uncertainty of supplies, and the ever-present need to endure hunger long enough to reach the next destination. Breakfast was not a feast, but a tool, a way to place one foot before the other and carry on. If we picture the medieval roads at dawn, we might see a procession of figures: pilgrims with staffs and satchels, merchants with pack animals, nobles riding with retinues, soldiers trudging in formation. And in their hands, almost always, the same foods appear: bread, cheese, ale. Eaten quickly, sometimes while walking, sometimes by a roadside fire, these foods sustained countless journeys. They were the taste of the road, humble but dependable. And so, the story of breakfast for travelers and pilgrims is one of necessity and endurance. It lacked the comfort of home or the luxury of noble halls, but it carried within it the spirit of the journey. Each bite of bread, each sip of ale, each shared piece of cheese was a step closer to a destination, a shrine, a market, or a battlefield. In the medieval world, to rise and eat on the road was to live within the great web of movement that tied villages, towns, and kingdoms together. Breakfast was not merely food, it was part of the journey itself, a companion to the weary feet that carried men and women across the landscapes of the Middle Ages. Life in the Middle Ages was ruled by the seasons. Long before electricity, refrigeration, or global trade, the turning of the year determined what could be eaten, when it could be eaten, and in what amounts. Food was never a constant supply. It ebbed and flowed like the rhythm of the sun and the changing of the fields. Nowhere was this more obvious than in the way people broke their fasts in the morning. What one might eat in the warmth of summer differed greatly from what could be found in the depths of winter. To understand the medieval breakfast, we must step into this cycle of abundance and scarcity, of light and darkness, of harvest and hunger. In summer, the mornings began earlier. The sun rose long before many were ready to rise, and with it came warmth and work. Fields beckoned with grain that needed tending, livestock needed driving out to pasture, and gardens called for constant care. The longer days meant more labor, but they also meant more food. Gardens yielded greens, beans, and peas. Orchards produced early fruits, and cows and goats gave plentiful milk. The abundance of the season made summer breakfasts, when they were taken, more colorful and varied than those of winter. A peasant might eat fresh bread baked from grain harvested the year before, paired with soft cheese or butter newly churned. A handful of berries picked from hedgerows, or apples and plums when in season, might accompany this meal. Ale was still the common drink, but fresh milk was more available in summer, especially for children, making it a rare treat in the mornings. For the wealthier classes, summer brought even greater variety. Nobles with access to orchards and vineyards could enjoy fruits at their morning tables. Honey was gathered from hives, and herbs from kitchen gardens flavored breads and cheeses. Cold meats left from previous feasts could be paired with these fresh additions, and fish, caught from rivers and ponds, were plentiful. On occasion, nobles might even enjoy exotic fruits brought from southern lands, figs or raisins, though these were luxuries, carried along long trade routes and saved for special moments. For them, the morning table in summer could be rich indeed, set with bread, fruit, cheese, and wine, each bite a reminder of wealth and the bounty of the season. Summer breakfasts were also shaped by the sheer energy required for work. For peasants laboring in fields under the sun, an early bite of bread or porridge might be necessary before the long hours of toil. The body needed fuel, and though the church frowned on indulgence at dawn, necessity often prevailed. A small bowl of gruel, made from oats or barley boiled in water or milk, might be eaten quickly before heading into the fields. This was not considered a full meal, but a way to keep strength until midday. Hunger was harder to endure when one worked in the blazing heat of summer, and so the morning meal grew in importance. Winter, by contrast, brought darkness and silence. Mornings were slow, with the sun reluctant to rise. The air was cold, hearths had to be coaxed back to life, and the land lay still, covered in frost or snow. Work continued. Of course, animals had to be fed, tools repaired, wool spun, bread baked, but it was not the frantic labor of summer. And yet, winter mornings were harder to endure for one simple reason. Food was scarce. What had been harvested in autumn had to last until spring, and each household rationed carefully. Fresh fruits and vegetables were gone, milk was less plentiful, and the preserved stores of salted meat, smoked fish, and dried grains dwindled with each passing week. Breakfast in winter was often the simplest of all. A crust of stale bread softened in ale or broth, a bit of pottage reheated from the night before, or perhaps nothing at all until midday. Ale continued to serve as the most reliable source of energy, brewed in large quantities during the harvest months to last through winter. Cheese, if it had been stored properly, could appear at the morning table, though it was often harder and saltier than the fresh cheeses of summer. Butter was scarce in the cold months, as milk supplies fell, and it was reserved for the wealthier or for special occasions. For nobles, winter breakfast could still be abundant, though less varied. Their storerooms and pantries were filled with salted meats, smoked hams, preserved fish, barrels of ale, and wines from distant vineyards. They could afford to eat roasted meats or rich pastries in the morning, even in the darkest days of the year. Spices, honey, and dried fruits, such as figs or raisins, added variety, but these were luxuries meant to offset the monotony of preserved foods. Still, even the great halls felt the limitation of the season. Freshness was gone, and even the wealthiest could not summon strawberries in January or pears in February. Winter tables were heavy, filling, and warming, but never light or fresh. The contrast between summer and winter breakfasts reflected not only the rhythm of the seasons, but also the precariousness of medieval survival. Summer was a time of energy, abundance, and color. Winter was a time of endurance, scarcity, and caution. To live through the year was to pass through these cycles, to enjoy the fullness of the harvest months, and then to tighten belts when the cold set in. Families knew the taste of both abundance and hunger, and their breakfasts, whether lavish or meager, told the story of the year's fortunes. The rhythm of fasting days and feast days added another layer. In winter especially, religious observances reminded people to restrain themselves. Many mornings passed with no food at all until after Mass, stretching the fast even longer. Yet on feast days, whether in summer or winter, the morning might bring rare delights. Cakes flavored with honey, or special breads enriched with eggs, could appear, breaking the monotony and lifting spirits. Such occasions stood out in memory, treasured in a world where most mornings were plain and repetitive. Children felt the difference of the seasons keenly. In summer, they might drink fresh milk, eat berries, or nibble on bread warm from the oven. In winter, they were given what could be spared thinner porridge, hardened cheese, or small sips of ale. Elders, too, felt the strain of winter, when teeth could not manage the hardness of stored bread or meat. For them, stews and pottages warmed at the hearth became essential, their soft textures easier to manage. The breakfast table, if it can be called that, was thus a mirror of the turning year. In summer, filled with greens and fruits, it echoed life and growth. In winter, heavy with stored foods or sometimes nearly empty, it echoed silence and survival. For peasants, this cycle meant the difference between strength and weakness, health and sickness. For nobles, it meant the difference between variety and monotony, abundance and restraint. For all, it was a reminder that no one in the medieval world stood apart from the seasons. And so, to think of breakfast in the Middle Ages is to think of the earth itself, its fields and orchards, its sun and snow, its cycles of plenty and want. The medieval morning was never the same in July as it was in January, never the same in harvest as in the hunger months of spring. Each season laid its hand upon the table, offering what it could, demanding patience when it could not. The people of that time accepted it, for there was no alternative. They rose with the sun, ate what the season allowed, and carried on, their lives entwined with the slow, unchanging rhythm of the year. To speak of the medieval breakfast is to speak in generalities, for Europe in the Middle Ages was not one single place, but a mosaic of lands, languages, and customs. What a villager ate in the quiet fields of England might differ from what a merchant ate in the bustling towns of France, and both would find something unfamiliar on the tables of Italy or Spain. Geography shaped agriculture, culture shaped appetite, and trade shaped possibility. And while bread, cheese, and ale appeared almost everywhere, the flavors of the morning shifted as one crossed borders, reminding us that even within a shared medieval world, diversity thrived at the breakfast table. In England, breakfast was often seen with suspicion well into the late Middle Ages, and yet necessity made it unavoidable. Peasants and laborers, who rose with the dawn to plow or reap, needed something to keep them steady. Bread was the foundation, coarse rye or barley for the poor, and lighter wheat bread for those of greater means. Ale was drunk at all hours, including the morning, for it was safer than water and more nourishing besides. Cheese was common when livestock allowed, and butter added richness when it could be spared. In towns, craftsmen might eat a quick meal of bread soaked in ale, or a pottage left simmering overnight. Among the gentry, breakfast might include cold meat or fish, especially for those setting out to hunt, for the chase required energy and endurance. Across the Channel, in France, wine appeared where England had ale. Vineyards stretched across wide regions, and wine was not the rare luxury it was in the north, but a staple of life. A French breakfast might be as simple as bread dipped in wine, or bread spread with soft cheese, often flavored with herbs from the garden. Fruits played a greater role, for France's climate and orchards offered apples, pears, and plums in abundance. For the wealthier, breakfast might include pastries, small tarts filled with fruits, or spiced dishes prepared by skilled cooks. The French nobility were famed for their refinement in food, and even the morning could reflect this, though often with restraint compared to later meals of the day. Traveling south to Italy, the influence of the Mediterranean became clear. Olive oil, so rare and precious in northern lands, was common here, and might be drizzled on bread even in the morning. Fruit was abundant, and figs, grapes, or oranges might grace the table when in season. Wine was lighter than in the north, sometimes watered, sometimes flavored with herbs, and taken even at dawn. Cheese was plentiful, both fresh and aged, and milk more often consumed than in England or France. For nobles, honeyed pastries or sweetened breads sometimes appeared, while for peasants, breakfast might be no more than bread dipped in oil or wine, eaten quickly before a day of labor beneath the Italian sun. Spain offered still another variation, for here the legacy of Islamic rule in parts of the peninsula brought spices, almonds, and new ways of preparing foods. In Andalusia, influenced by Arabic cuisine, breakfast could include flatbreads, honey, and almonds, a blend of sweetness and sustenance. In Christian kingdoms to the north, the fare was simpler, yet still flavored by the presence of olives, grapes, and figs. Cheese and cured meats were common, especially among shepherds and farmers, who carried their morning meals into the fields. As in Italy, olive oil was plentiful, and bread dipped in oil might serve as the first food of the day. For nobles, spiced pastries, or even rice dishes, flavored with saffron, could appear, reminding us of the cultural exchanges alive in medieval Spain. In the colder regions of northern and eastern Europe, breakfast took a different shape. In Scandinavia, for example, bread was often flat and dense, baked to last, and eaten with butter or cheese. Fish was central, salted or smoked, and consumed even in the morning. Ale was drunk here as well, though mead fermented honey sometimes appeared in wealthier households. The climate demanded heavier fare, and porridge made from oats or barley was common, warming the body against the chill. In Eastern Europe, grains like millet and buckwheat shaped breakfasts, often in the form of porridges or breads, eaten with cheese or curd. The harsher climate made preservation essential, and salted meats or pickled vegetables could appear even in the morning. Monasteries across Europe also reflected regional differences. In Italy, monks might have eaten bread with olive oil, while in France they drank wine with their meals. In England, ale was more common. Yet across these differences, the rhythm of fasting until later in the day persisted, reminding us that while local foods varied, religious discipline bound much of Europe together. Pilgrims traveling across countries would have noticed these differences sharply, tasting new flavors in each region, even if their meals remained simple and modest. Nobles, of course, had the greatest variety at their disposal, for trade brought exotic goods from afar. In England, nobles might enjoy imported raisins or figs with their bread. In France, cinnamon and cloves could be added to wine even in the morning. In Italy and Spain, sugar, though rare, was known, and sometimes used to sweeten pastries. Yet these were luxuries, reminders of wealth, and not daily fare for most. The majority of the population, no matter the region, ate what the land around them provided. The rhythms of the seasons were felt everywhere, but in different ways. In England, winter meant hard bread and ale, while summer brought berries and fresh milk. In Italy, winter still offered olives and citrus fruits, while summer overflowed with figs and grapes. Spain enjoyed almonds and honey throughout the year, while Scandinavia relied on preserved fish and grain stores to endure the cold. Each land adapted to its climate, shaping breakfasts that were practical and sustaining. What is perhaps most striking is how these differences reveal the diversity of medieval Europe. To speak of bread in England meant something different than bread in Italy, where wheat was more common and loaves lighter. To drink wine in France was as ordinary as ale in England. To eat olives in Spain was as natural as eating apples in the north. Each region carried its own identity, woven into the foods of the morning. Yet for all the differences, there was also a shared simplicity. Breakfast, when it was eaten, was rarely elaborate, rarely the main focus of the day. Whether bread dipped in ale, wine, or oil, whether cheese from cows, goats, or sheep, whether fruits from orchards or salted fish from the sea, the morning meal was plain, practical, and often hurried. The true feasting, the grand meals of the day, came later. Breakfast remained a quiet thing, shaped more by necessity than by indulgence, more by the land than by the table. If we close our eyes and imagine traveling across medieval Europe at dawn, we can picture it. In England, a farmer chewing rye bread with ale before walking into the fields. In France, a craftsman dipping bread into wine, savoring the sweetness of grapes from local vines. In Italy, a peasant eating figs and bread with oil beneath the rising sun. In Spain, a pilgrim nibbling on honey and almonds before resuming the long road to Santiago. In Scandinavia, a fisherman eating salted herring with bread as he sets out to sea. Each scene is different, yet all are bound by the same simplicity, the same quiet act of breaking the night's fast before beginning the day's work. And so, breakfast across medieval regions tells us not only about food, but about the land, the climate, and the people themselves. It reminds us that even in an age before global trade and instant access to every ingredient, variety was abundant, carried by the soil, the sun, and the traditions of each place. To know what a person ate in the morning is to know where they lived, who they were, and how they saw the world around them. In the medieval world, not everyone approached food in the same way. Age shaped appetite and need just as much as class or region. Children and the elderly, the very young and the very old, stood apart from the rest of society in their relationship with the morning meal. Their bodies asked for something gentler, something easier to eat and digest, and their families often had to adapt what little they had to provide for them. To look at the breakfasts of children and elders is to glimpse both the tenderness and the hardship of medieval life. For in these vulnerable groups we see most clearly how society cared for, or sometimes neglected, those unable to labor with full strength. For children, mornings began as they did for adults, with the rising sun and the duties of the household. Yet unlike grown men and women, children did not always face the fields or workshops with an empty stomach. Parents, when they could, tried to spare a little food for their sons and daughters. Bread was most common, a small slice softened in milk when milk was available, or in ale if milk could not be spared. This was easier for small teeth to manage, and gentler on young stomachs. Porridge made from oats, barley, or millet, boiled in water or milk, was another frequent breakfast for children. It was warm, soft, and filling, and could be sweetened with honey or flavored with herbs when families had the means. Milk itself was prized for children, though it was never in endless supply. Cows, goats, and sheep produced only so much, and milk had many competing uses. It could be drunk fresh, but it was often churned into butter or made into cheese, which lasted longer and supported the whole household. Yet when an animal was producing well, mothers might pour some into a child's wooden cup, offering nourishment richer than bread alone. In winter, this was rarer, as animals gave less milk. In summer, children might have more frequent access, and so their breakfasts followed the rhythm of the seasons as much as their parents'. As children grew older, their breakfasts became more like those of adults: bread, cheese, and ale. Even very young children drank small beer, weakly fermented ale, because it was safer than water and carried a few calories besides. What might strike us as strange, that children drank ale daily, was to them entirely ordinary. It was not strong, and it sustained them as much as their parents. By the age of 6 or 7, children were already helping with chores, and by 10 or 12, they worked nearly as hard as adults. Their breakfasts reflected this transition, no longer softened with milk, but sturdy enough to fuel laboring hands. In noble households, children fared better. They had access to fine wheat bread, fresh milk, and often more varied foods. A noble child might eat eggs in the morning, or fruit when in season. Honey was more common in such households, and porridge might be sweetened generously to please a child's taste. Tutors and caregivers sometimes emphasized moderation, teaching restraint even to the young, for indulgence was frowned upon. Still, noble children were rarely left hungry in the morning, for their families had the wealth to provide. Their breakfasts were not feasts, but they were reliable and nourishing, reflecting both privilege and parental care. For the elderly, the story was different. Old age in the Middle Ages was rare compared to today, but those who reached it faced the challenges of weakened bodies and fragile health. Teeth wore down or were lost, making hard bread difficult to chew. Stomachs became less able to digest heavy foods, and illness often reduced appetite. Breakfasts for elders had to be softer, gentler, and easier to swallow. Pottage was the most common solution. A thin stew of grains and vegetables, simmered until soft, could be eaten even without teeth. Bread was often soaked in broth, ale, or milk to soften it, turning it into a kind of gruel. Families often adapted their meals for elders, giving them the softer portions of whatever was available. Cheese could be grated or softened, eggs boiled until tender, fruit stewed into compotes when possible. These small adjustments showed care, for elders were respected in many households, their wisdom valued even as their strength waned. Yet in poorer families, when food was scarce, the elderly often ate last, after children and workers had been fed. In such cases, their breakfasts might be meager indeed, perhaps only a small crust of bread or a sip of ale, hardly enough to sustain them. Hunger in old age was common, and it made survival through harsh winters especially difficult. Monastic records sometimes mention allowances made for elderly monks. While the rule of Saint Benedict was strict about fasting and meal times, older brothers who could not endure long hours without food were sometimes permitted to eat earlier or to take softer foods. This reflected a broader awareness in medieval society that while discipline and restraint were praised, mercy was needed for those whose bodies could no longer endure the full rigors of life. The difference between classes showed itself strongly in old age as well. A noble elder could expect softer breads, rich broths, and even imported fruits to ease digestion. Spiced wines or medicinal concoctions made from herbs might also be taken in the morning, intended to strengthen the body and soothe ailments. In contrast, a peasant elder might have little more than what everyone else ate, only softened to suit their needs. If the household was poor, even that might not be guaranteed. Breakfast for children and elders thus reflected both tenderness and hardship. In moments of abundance, parents and families did what they could to ease hunger for the young and the old. Bowls of porridge were prepared, cups of milk poured, bread softened, fruit stewed. In moments of scarcity, these same groups often suffered most, for their needs were weighed against the demands of those whose labor sustained the household. The working men and women needed fuel to plow, reap, spin, and weave. Children and elders, less productive, might be given less. It was a harsh calculation, but one that hunger often forced upon families. And yet, there were also moments of joy. A child tasting honey stirred into porridge on a feast day. An elder sipping warm broth by the fire while the household stirred awake. These small acts of care broke through the hardship, reminding us that medieval families, despite poverty and struggle, valued love and respect. Food, even in its simplest form, carried meaning. It was not only about filling the stomach, but also about showing compassion, about remembering who most needed gentleness in a world that was often hard. So the breakfasts of children and elders reveal the humanity of the medieval world. They remind us that life was not only about survival and labor, but also about care, patience, and adaptation. In the soft porridge of a child or the warmed broth of an elder, we glimpse the quiet love of families doing their best with what they had. We see the fragility of life, the way hunger pressed most heavily upon the young and the old, and the ways in which people strove to ease that burden, even when resources were scarce. And so, while the medieval morning might be remembered for its bread, ale, and cheese within the homes of families, it was also remembered for the ways food was softened, sweetened, or saved for those who could not endure hunger as easily as others. It was in these moments, quiet and tender, that the meaning of breakfast for children and the elderly became clear, not indulgence, not abundance, but care in the face of hardship, a small act of mercy at the start of the day. The medieval world was built on work. Fields had to be plowed and sown, iron had to be forged, wood had to be cut, wool had to be spun, and stone had to be shaped into churches, bridges, and castles. None of these tasks could be done without the strength of ordinary men and women, whose labor sustained not only their families, but the entire fabric of society. Their mornings were not marked by leisure or ceremony, but by the knowledge that the day ahead would demand every ounce of strength. For them, breakfast was less about indulgence and more about fuel, a practical act to prepare body and spirit for long hours of labor. Farmers rose with the sun, sometimes before. The animals needed feeding, the tools needed mending, and the fields called for attention in every season. Spring brought plowing and sowing, summer demanded weeding and harvesting, autumn required gathering and storing, and even winter demanded work in the barns and by the hearth. For the farmer, the body was the tool that could not fail, and food, even in small amounts, was what kept it working. Bread was the constant companion. Heavy rye or barley loaves baked days before and kept for daily use. In the morning, a farmer might take a piece of this bread, chew it slowly as he walked to the fields, and wash it down with a sip of ale. It was not much, but it was something to keep him steady until the midday meal, which was usually the largest of the day. Sometimes, when the work was especially demanding, more might be eaten in the morning. A bowl of pottage, reheated from the night before, might be ladled out at dawn, filled with grains, beans, onions, or cabbage. If the family was fortunate enough to have some bacon or salted pork, bits might flavor the stew, giving it strength and richness. On feast days or during harvest, when labor stretched long and hard, a heartier start was sometimes allowed, for the fields could not be left waiting, and a weak body could not wield a scythe or plow. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and masons also required sustenance at the start of the day. Their work was not in the open fields, but in workshops and yards, yet it demanded no less strength. The blacksmith faced the heat of the forge, hammering iron into tools, nails, and horseshoes. The carpenter lifted beams, sawed wood, and crafted frames for homes and barns. The mason chipped at stone, carried blocks, and built walls that would last for centuries. Such labor consumed energy quickly, and to enter the workshop with an empty stomach was to risk faintness before midday. These men often began their days with bread and cheese, washed down with ale. For those who could afford it, eggs or cold meat might be added, offering extra strength. A slice of cured ham or salted fish gave protein, though it was not common for every household. The sounds of these trades in the morning carried through towns and villages, the ring of hammers on anvils, the rasp of saws, the thud of chisels. Each sound was fueled by food, however modest. The bread may have been stale, the ale weak, but it was enough to keep hands steady and arms strong. In towns where markets bustled, Tradesmen might sometimes buy food to begin their day: meat pies, pastries, or rolls from bakers. Such breakfasts were more varied than those in the countryside, though they cost coin and were therefore not daily luxuries. Still, the presence of markets gave urban laborers more choice, and their mornings sometimes included warm foods, especially in colder months. Women, too, labored heavily, and their breakfasts reflected the same balance of necessity and scarcity. A woman spinning wool, kneading dough, tending animals, or working alongside men in the fields also needed strength. Her morning food was no different: bread, ale, perhaps porridge, perhaps cheese. For women of towns who worked as washerwomen, seamstresses, or market sellers, the same was true. Food was fuel, and without it, the long hours of work would be unbearable. The timing of breakfast for workers was fluid. Some ate a little before beginning, others delayed until after the first hours of labor. In many places, it was common to begin work immediately at dawn, then pause mid-morning for a small meal, sometimes called Nunchen, a word that later evolved into luncheon. This pause, often taken in the fields or workshops themselves, might consist of bread and ale carried from home, eaten quickly before returning to work. Thus, what we might call breakfast was not always eaten upon waking, but after the first tasks of the day had already begun. The quality of breakfast varied with wealth and season. A prosperous farmer might enjoy bread of finer grain, cheese from his own animals, and perhaps fresh eggs. A poor laborer might have little more than crusts and weak ale. In times of famine, even this could vanish, and workers began their days on empty stomachs, forcing themselves through fatigue until the next meal. Such hunger was not uncommon, and it marked the lives of countless peasants and laborers, whose strength was expected even when their bodies lacked nourishment. Noble employers sometimes provided food for their workers, especially during harvest, when large numbers were needed to bring in crops quickly. Records from estates show that workers were often given bread, cheese, and ale in the mornings, not out of generosity, but out of necessity. A well-fed laborer worked harder and longer, and it was in the Lord's interest to keep his tenants strong. These meals might be taken communally in the fields, with workers sitting together, breaking bread, and drinking ale before returning to scythes and sickles. The relationship between work and food was deeply practical. Medieval people did not think of breakfast as a leisurely ritual or a carefully balanced meal for health. It was simply a matter of survival. The body needed strength, and strength came from bread, cheese, meat, and drink. A farmer did not wonder if his food was healthy or refined. He wondered only if it was enough to get him through the day. And yet, there was fellowship in these meals. To eat with fellow workers at dawn or mid-morning was to share not only food, but also the burden of labor. Bread was passed from hand to hand, mugs of ale shared, jokes and prayers murmured as the sun rose higher. Even in hardship, there was a sense of community, of facing the day together. Food bound people not only to their work, but also to one another. In the great sweep of medieval life, the breakfasts of farmers, smiths, and laborers remind us of the unbreakable link between labor and sustenance. To work was to need fuel, and to eat was to prepare for toil. These meals were rarely abundant, rarely indulgent, but they carried within them the energy that built fields of grain, tools of iron, houses of wood, and cathedrals of stone. The world of the Middle Ages was shaped by their hands, and those hands were steadied each morning by bread, ale, and whatever small portion could be spared. So when we think of breakfast in the Middle Ages, we must think of these workers rising at dawn, pulling on rough clothes, taking a bite of bread, a sip of ale, and stepping into long hours of labor. Their mornings were not about comfort, but about endurance. And in their simple breakfasts, we see the quiet strength of a world built not on luxury, but on work. Though the majority of medieval people began their days with bread, cheese, and ale, or sometimes with nothing at all, there were always those who lived in a different world. Nobles, wealthy merchants, and members of royal courts had access to luxuries that peasants could scarcely imagine. For these households, breakfast could at times become more than a plain and practical meal. It could be an expression of wealth, a stage for imported delicacies, or a moment to display the household's refinement. The morning table of the wealthy was still not as formalized or elaborate as the feasts held later in the day. But when luxuries appeared at dawn, they transformed the simple act of eating into something symbolic of status and privilege. One of the greatest luxuries was fine bread made from pure wheat flour. While peasants ate dense rye or barley loaves, the wealthy enjoyed white bread, soft and delicate, sieved through fine cloth to remove every husk and impurity. This manchet bread was a mark of status, for only the wealthy could afford the expense of cultivating and refining wheat. To place white bread on the morning table was to declare prosperity. Paired with fresh butter, rich cheese, or sweet honey, it became a meal that reminded both hosts and guests of their rank. Sweetness itself was a luxury in the Middle Ages. Sugar, imported at great cost from the Mediterranean and later from farther afield, was rare and precious. When it appeared, it was often used sparingly in medicines or in dishes meant to impress. A sweetened pastry or cake at breakfast was a true sign of wealth, for sugar was far more expensive than honey, which was the common sweetener available to all. Nobles sometimes flavored their breads or porridges with sugar, or served preserved fruits coated in it. A display that was as much about showing access to trade networks as it was about satisfying taste. Honey, though more common, could also be presented in abundance as a luxury, especially when combined with almonds, figs, or spices. Spices themselves were among the most coveted luxuries of the medieval age. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, pepper, and ginger traveled along long and dangerous trade routes, passing through many hands before reaching Europe. To sprinkle cinnamon into wine or ginger into porridge at breakfast was to demonstrate access to the distant riches of the East. Such flavors transformed ordinary foods, making them exotic and desirable. A noble might sip spiced wine in the morning, or eat meat seasoned with pepper, while their poorer counterparts could only dream of such tastes. Meats themselves were also a mark of luxury when eaten at breakfast. While peasants might rarely taste meat except on feast days, nobles had access to venison, pork, poultry, and game birds, often left from the previous night's feast. To eat cold slices of roasted venison at dawn was to live in a different world entirely from the peasant chewing on crusts. Fish, too, was abundant for the wealthy, particularly when salted or smoked varieties were stored in large quantities. Salmon, eel, and sturgeon graced noble tables, sometimes even at the start of the day. The presence of meat or fish at breakfast was not simply about nourishment, it was a statement of abundance. Dairy, while common to all classes in some form, also had its luxurious variations. Nobles enjoyed fresh, creamy cheeses flavored with herbs or spices, or rich butters churned from well-fed cows. These products were smoother, richer, and far more plentiful than the rougher, saltier versions eaten by peasants. Eggs, too, appeared often, boiled, fried, or baked into tarts and pastries. For a noble household, the morning could begin with foods that others only tasted on rare occasions, or never at all. Fruits, when they appeared out of season, or preserved with sugar, were luxuries beyond measure. Fresh fruits in summer were available even to peasants, gathered from hedgerows or orchards. But to eat figs, raisins, dates, or oranges in winter was another matter entirely. These fruits came from southern lands, carried across seas and mountains, and their presence on a morning table was a sign of wealth and connection. A noble might offer stewed fruits spiced with cinnamon, or dried figs dipped in honey, as part of a breakfast meant to impress guests or comfort the family. The vessels and presentation of these foods also reflected luxury. Where peasants ate from wooden bowls and drank from rough mugs, nobles dined from silver or pewter, their tables set with fine cloths and delicate goblets. The very act of eating in such surroundings elevated the morning meal, making even a simple dish of bread and cheese appear refined. Servants prepared and presented the food, emphasizing the distance between those who ate and those who labored. Breakfast in these settings was not only about what was consumed, but about how it was consumed, a display of order, wealth, and hierarchy. Yet it is worth noting that even among the wealthy, breakfast did not always hold the importance it does today. It was still often lighter than other meals, sometimes even skipped altogether. Luxuries were more likely to appear when guests were present or on special days, rather than as a daily habit. The idea of a lavish breakfast spread each morning belongs more to later centuries than to the Middle Ages. Still, when luxuries did appear, they were remembered. Chronicles and letters sometimes describe noble households offering spiced wines or sugared fruits at dawn. Details included because they were remarkable enough to note. The presence of these luxuries at the morning table also reflected broader shifts in the medieval world. As trade expanded, spices, sugar, and fruits became more accessible, though still costly. Merchants grew wealthy by importing and selling these goods, and nobles competed to show their refinement by using them. The morning table thus became a stage for displaying one's connections to trade and power. To eat cinnamon or sugar at dawn was not only a pleasure of taste, but a statement of one's place in the world. For us today, it is easy to imagine these noble breakfasts as indulgent and extravagant. Yet in the medieval mind, they were tempered by the awareness of sin and gluttony. The Church's warnings against indulgence still carried weight, and many nobles were careful to frame their morning luxuries as moderation rather than excess. A slice of sugared bread or a cup of spiced wine could be justified as medicinal, strengthening the body for prayer and duties. In this way, luxury was wrapped in the language of necessity, allowing the wealthy to enjoy their privileges while maintaining the appearance of restraint. And so, while the majority of medieval people began their days with the simplest of foods, a small portion of society greeted the morning with the taste of distant lands and costly imports. Their breakfasts were never grand feasts, but they were marked by luxuries that symbolized wealth, refinement, and connection to the wider world. To see a noble eating sugared fruits at dawn, or sipping spiced wine, was to glimpse the gap between the lives of the few and the many. It was a reminder that even in something as humble as breakfast, status was always present, shaping who ate what and how. In the Middle Ages, food was never just about survival. It was also about the soul. Every bite, every meal, every fast was touched by the presence of the Church, which guided the rhythm of life in almost every corner of Europe. And when it came to breakfast, religion played a central role in shaping how people thought about eating in the early hours of the day. To us, eating after waking feels natural, but to the medieval mind, it carried moral weight. To eat too soon could be indulgence, a temptation of gluttony. To refrain from eating was discipline, a way of aligning the body with the spirit. Between fasting and feasting, restraint and celebration, the morning meal became a stage upon which the drama of faith was played out. The suspicion of breakfast had deep roots in Christian teaching. Gluttony, one of the 7 deadly sins, was defined not only as overeating, but also as eating at the wrong times or with too much eagerness. To wake and immediately turn to food suggested weakness of the flesh, a lack of spiritual discipline. Many preachers warned their congregations that to break the fast too early was to put the needs of the stomach above the needs of the soul. For monks, guided by the rule of Saint Benedict, the fast after night was expected to last until mid-morning, after prayer and labor had been performed. Their example spread into society, influencing how lay people thought about the morality of eating at dawn. This did not mean that no one ate in the morning. Peasants, laborers, and travelers often had to, for hunger made work impossible. But even then, the act was sometimes accompanied by unease, a sense that it was necessary, but not ideal. To eat before Mass, especially, was frowned upon. Many communities expected that the first food of the day would not be taken until after attending church, at least on holy days. The rhythm of prayer thus shaped the rhythm of breakfast. At the same time, fasting was woven into the fabric of the year. Entire seasons, such as Lent, were marked by restrictions on when and what could be eaten. Meat was forbidden on many days, replaced by fish, eggs, or dairy, depending on local rules. In some regions, even dairy was forbidden, leaving people with bread, vegetables, and thin cottages. To break the fast in the morning during these seasons was doubly frowned upon, for fasting was not only a matter of personal discipline, but also of collective obligation. Everyone shared in it, from nobles in their castles to peasants in their cottages. And yet, feasting also shaped the morning. On great feast days, the rules were lifted, and abundance replaced restraint. Religious festivals brought early meals filled with richness and variety. Special breads were baked, flavored with honey, eggs, or spices. Porridges were sweetened, wines mulled, meats roasted. On Christmas, Easter, and other holy days, even the morning could become festive, filled with foods that were rare the rest of the year. Children remembered these mornings most vividly, when ordinary porridge was transformed into a delight, when honey or dried fruits made the first meal of the day something to celebrate. The balance between fasting and feasting was central to medieval life. The year was not one of steady consumption, but of constant ebb and flow, guided by the Church's calendar. Days of denial were followed by days of indulgence, and the rhythm of the body was tied to the rhythm of worship. Breakfast reflected this. On ordinary days, it was plain or absent. On fast days, it might vanish entirely. On feast days, it appeared in abundance, glowing with the rare sweetness of luxury. The language of sin surrounded the morning meal as well. To linger too long over food, to eat more than necessary, or to eat with greed, was condemned from pulpits and confessionals. Medieval sermons often used gluttony as a warning, reminding listeners that even something as small as a piece of bread at the wrong hour could reveal weakness of spirit. Parents passed these lessons to children, teaching them not to beg for food before the proper time, and to see hunger as a test of patience. Hunger was not only a physical state, but also a spiritual exercise. To endure it well was virtuous. To resist it poorly was sinful. For nobles, this tension was sharper. Their wealth gave them access to luxuries, yet they were constantly reminded that indulgence brought danger to the soul. A nobleman sipping spiced wine at dawn might tell himself it was for his health, a medicine rather than an indulgence. A lady eating sugared fruit might frame it as necessity for strength. The Church's teachings encouraged this careful framing, a way of enjoying privileges while avoiding the appearance of sin. Breakfast in noble households thus carried a moral weight beyond its taste, shaped as much by confession and conscience as by appetite. For monks and nuns, the rules were even stricter. In many monasteries, no food was eaten at all until the main meal at midday, unless the rule allowed exceptions for the elderly, the sick, or children in their care. When exceptions were made, the morning meal was simple, perhaps bread softened in ale or milk, or a small portion of pottage. Eating early was never considered a pleasure, but always a concession, a bending of discipline in the face of necessity. The act of eating remained bound to prayer, silence, and humility. Yet even within this framework of restraint, joy found its place. Feast days lifted restrictions, and breakfast could become a symbol of celebration. The smell of honey cakes baking at dawn, the sight of sweet rolls shared after morning mass, the warmth of mulled wine in cold winter mornings, all of these moments revealed the other side of medieval religion, where food was not only about denial, but also about gratitude and abundance. The people of the Middle Ages believed that God provided, and to enjoy his gifts on feast days was not sin, but worship, a taste of heavenly joy on earth. What emerges from this picture is not a world of uniform practice, but but one of balance. Some mornings were marked by emptiness, where hunger was endured in silence. Others were marked by plenty, where tables overflowed with bread, meat, wine, and sweets. The rhythm of fasting and feasting, denial and indulgence, gave shape to the medieval year and to the morning meal within it. Breakfast was not simply food. It was part of a larger story, one where the body and soul were always in conversation, always negotiating the needs of survival with the demands of faith. And so, breakfast in the Middle Ages cannot be understood apart from religion. It was not simply bread or ale or porridge, but a reflection of belief, discipline, and devotion. To eat or not to eat in the morning was not only a practical choice, but also a moral one. Every crumb carried meaning. Every sip was part of a greater story. In the quiet of the dawn, in monasteries, cottages, and castles alike, people weighed their hunger against their faith, and in doing so, gave shape to the medieval morning. When we imagine castles, we often think of feasts-long tables heavy with roasted meats, golden goblets filled with wine, and servants bustling to and fro with platters of food. And while it is true that banquets were central to the life of nobility, the day did not always begin with grandeur. Breakfast in castles and courts was shaped by the same medieval attitudes that touched peasants and townsfolk alike: suspicion toward early eating, the influence of the church, and the practical demands of daily life. Yet within these fortified walls, the morning meal could sometimes take on a scale and elegance that set it apart from the simpler fare of the countryside. The rhythm of life in a castle began slowly compared to that of the peasant's hut. Nobles rose later, often after the first light of morning, their days structured around hunting, governance, or ceremonies rather than the relentless grind of fieldwork. Servants, however, rose early, tending fires, preparing rooms, and seeing to the kitchens. The kitchens themselves were immense, often separate from the main hall to reduce the risk of fire. Here, cooks and assistants stirred cauldrons, kneaded dough, and prepared whatever was needed for the day's meals. If breakfast was to be served, it was their hands that made it possible. What appeared on the noble table in the morning varied widely. Some lords and ladies took little more than bread and wine, or bread and ale, in keeping with tradition and restraint. Others indulged more freely, beginning the day with meats, pastries, or sweetened dishes. Leftovers from the previous night's feast often appeared, sliced and served cold. Roasted venison, pork, or poultry might reappear on trenchers of bread, flavored with spices that had lingered from the feast. Fish, too, was common, especially in regions close to rivers or seas. Smoked or salted fish could be brought forth quickly, and fresh catches were sometimes prepared in the early morning hours for noble households that expected variety at every table. Bread was always present, but unlike the coarse loaves of peasants, noble bread was made from fine white wheat, light and soft, sieved of impurities. Butter, cheese, and honey often accompanied it, making even a simple slice into something rich. Eggs were common, boiled or fried, or baked into pies and tarts. Nobles with larger kitchens could indulge in pastries, often filled with fruits or meats, or sweetened with honey and spices. These were not daily fare for peasants, but within castles they became markers of refinement. Beverages also marked the difference between noble and common tables. While ale was consumed by everyone, nobles often had access to wines imported from France, Spain, or Italy. Wine might be drunk plain, or mulled with cinnamon, cloves, or nutmeg, creating a warming drink for cold mornings. Spiced wine at dawn was not merely a pleasure of taste, but also a display of wealth, for the spices themselves were treasures carried across continents. Some nobles drank hippocras, a mixture of wine, sugar, and spices, thought to aid digestion and health. Even in the morning, these refined beverages set the nobility apart from the rest of society. Breakfast in castles also reflected the presence of guests. Hospitality was a duty of the nobility. and visitors, whether fellow nobles, clergy, or messengers, were often fed in the morning. In these cases, breakfast could be more elaborate, prepared to impress as much as to nourish. Tables might be set with platters of meats, pastries, fruits, and spiced drinks, far beyond what the household would eat in private. The morning meal thus became a tool of diplomacy and display, a stage upon which wealth and generosity were shown. Courts, where kings and queens resided, amplified these practices. The royal household was vast, with kitchens that employed dozens of cooks, bakers, and servants. The variety of food available was immense, yet even here, breakfast was not always a grand event. Many monarchs began their day with something simple: bread and wine, perhaps a bit of fruit or cheese. Yet when the court entertained foreign envoys or celebrated holy days, the morning could glitter with abundance. Exotic fruits, spiced wines, sugared pastries, and delicate meats appeared, all meant to showcase the power and reach of the monarchy. To eat such foods in the morning was not necessity but ceremony, a demonstration that the crown commanded the wealth of kingdoms and the riches of trade. Servants in these households experienced breakfast differently. While nobles dined in halls or private chambers, the kitchens fed their staff with plainer fare. Bread, pottage, and ale were common, enough to keep them strong for the day's labor. Servants sometimes ate earlier than their masters, fueling themselves before carrying trays and preparing tables. Their meals, though simple, were steady, for a well-fed servant worked better, and noble households understood the necessity of feeding their retainers. Religion still hovered over these noble mornings. The Church's teachings about restraint meant that even the wealthiest were cautious about indulgence. To eat too much too early could be criticized as gluttony, and nobles often balanced luxury with appearances of moderation. A slice of sugared bread or a cup of spiced wine could be explained as medicinal, strengthening the body for duties ahead. On fasting days, the restrictions applied to nobles as much as to peasants, and breakfast vanished entirely, or shifted to plain foods like bread and water. The presence of confessors and chaplains within castles ensured that religion was never far from the morning table. The atmosphere of a noble breakfast differed from that of the great feasts. It was quieter, less ceremonial, more intimate. Instead of musicians and entertainers, there was the soft crackle of fires and the murmur of conversation. Servants moved quietly, pouring wine, setting bread, and clearing platters. Nobles might discuss the day's business hunts, councils, letters, or journeys while eating. In castles, mornings were a time of preparation, not celebration, and breakfast reflected this tone. Yet, despite its relative modesty compared to banquets, breakfast in castles and courts revealed the gulf between classes. Where peasants chewed hard rye bread, nobles enjoyed manchet loaves. Where peasants drank weak ale, nobles sipped spiced wines. Where peasants shared a single piece of cheese among a family, nobles had platters of meats, fruits, and pastries. Even when both groups ate bread, the bread was not the same. Even when both drank ale, the ale was brewed differently. Breakfast, like every other meal, became a symbol of status. To imagine breakfast in a castle is to picture a hall lit by tall windows or flickering torches, long tables laid with fine cloth, silver goblets gleaming in the light. A lord might take his seat at the head, breaking bread with honey, while a lady sipped wine. Children ate softer foods, eggs or fruits, while servants moved about, attentive and silent. Beyond the walls, peasants bent over fields with nothing more than crusts and ale. Yet inside, the morning table told a story of abundance, refinement, and power. And so, castles and courts show us that breakfast in the Middle Ages was not only about food, but also about image. To eat in the morning was to begin the day not only with nourishment, but with a reminder of one's place in the world. Nobles could afford luxuries, but they tempered them with caution. They displayed wealth when needed, offered generosity to guests, and shaped their mornings according to tradition and faith. The peasants' morning was about survival. The nobles' was about balance between privilege and restraint. Both began the day in their own ways, but the distance between their tables was as vast as the walls of the castles themselves. War was one of the constants of the Middle Ages. Lords fought over lands, kings clashed for crowns, and knights rode to battle beneath banners of loyalty and ambition. For the ordinary soldier, whether knight in armor or peasant with a spear, the battlefield was both a place of fear and duty. And in the midst of this world of weapons and blood, even something as ordinary as breakfast took on new meaning. To eat before battle was to prepare not just for labor, but for survival itself. The foods might have been the same bread, cheese, ale, and meat, but the context gave them weight, for no one knew if that morning meal might be their last. Armies moved early. Marches began at dawn, when the light stretched across fields and forests, and commanders called their men to readiness. Soldiers woke stiff from sleeping on the ground or in tents, their armor cold, their bodies sore. Hunger was sharp in those moments, and food, if available, was distributed quickly. Bread was always the most common fare, carried in sacks or wagons, often hard and stale from days on the march. Soldiers softened it in ale or broth, or chewed it dry if nothing else was at hand. Cheese, salted and firm, was another frequent companion, easy to carry and slow to spoil. Together, bread and cheese made the simplest of breakfasts, yet one that could steady a soldier before facing the terror of the battlefield. Ale was also central, even here. Soldiers drank it not for pleasure, but for need. Water on campaign was often untrustworthy, drawn from streams or ponds that might be fouled. Ale, even when weak, was safer and carried calories. It was distributed in wooden mugs or shared from flasks, passed from hand to hand. The warmth of ale in the stomach brought a small comfort, a steadying presence before the chaos of the day. Wine, too, was common in some regions, particularly in France and Italy, where vineyards supplied armies as much as they supplied towns. Commanders and knights drank stronger versions, while foot soldiers received the weaker, watered-down wine that still offered strength. Meat, when available, was prized on campaign. Soldiers hunted animals as they moved, or slaughtered livestock taken from nearby lands. Salted pork, smoked fish, or dried sausages were distributed, especially before major battles. A fat and protein offered strength for long hours of fighting. Sometimes these meats were boiled into stews in great cauldrons, shared among companies of men, the steam rising into the morning air. A bowl of hot stew, even if thin, was a blessing on a cold morning, fortifying soldiers before they marched into danger. For knights and commanders, breakfast often looked different. Their wealth allowed for better provisions, carried in supply wagons or prepared by personal attendants. A knight might eat white bread, soft cheese, and cold roast meat left from the night before, washed down with spiced wine. Eggs, fruits, and pastries sometimes appeared at noble tables even in camp, though such luxuries were not always practical. Still, for those of higher rank, breakfast on campaign was yet another place where status showed itself. Soldiers ate crusts. Knights ate choice cuts. Yet once battle began, hunger and fear made all men equal, for food could not shield them from what was to come. Pilgrimages of war, such as the Crusades, brought yet another variation. Armies traveling long distances across Europe and into the Levant carried what provisions they could, often depending on supply ships or local resources. Breakfasts on these journeys might include dried fruits, almonds, or flatbreads, foods influenced by the lands they passed through. In some cases, they tasted spices and sweets that were unknown in their homelands, reminders that even war brought cultural exchanges. But most mornings, even in the midst of distant campaigns, soldiers still began the day with the same staples of bread, cheese, and drink. The atmosphere of these breakfasts was unlike that of home. There was little quiet or leisure. Men gathered around fires, clutching bread in cold hands, listening to the sounds of armor being buckled, swords drawn, horses saddled. The air was tense, filled with anticipation and fear. Conversations were hushed, prayers whispered, laughter forced. For many, the act of eating was mechanical, more about calming the stomach than enjoying the taste. They knew that within hours, the same hands that held bread might hold weapons, and the same mouths that chewed cheese might cry out in battle. Breakfast was not a moment of peace, but a preparation for chaos. Religion also colored these mornings. Soldiers often prayed before eating, asking God for strength and protection. Chaplains moved among the men, blessing them, reminding them of the righteousness of their cause, or offering last rites to those who feared they might not see another day. For many, the act of eating bread before battle carried spiritual weight, echoing the bread of the Eucharist, a reminder that their struggle was tied to faith. This gave breakfast a sense of solemnity, a moment where body and soul were prepared together. Supply was always uncertain on campaign. Armies relied on supply trains that often lagged behind, or on the lands they moved through, which might be stripped bare by their passing. Hunger was frequent, and many mornings came with no food at all. Soldiers marched into battle with empty stomachs, weakened and weary, their strength drawn not from food, but from desperation. Chronicles of medieval wars often describe famines within armies, when men ate roots, weeds, or even horseflesh to survive. In such times, breakfast was no longer bread and ale, but whatever could be found, a grim reminder of how fragile armies could be when supplies failed. Yet, when provisions were plentiful, breakfast could raise morale. A soldier who began the day with bread, cheese, and meat was steadier, more confident. Commanders understood this, and some made efforts to ensure their men were fed before battle. A hot stew, a ration of meat, or even extra ale could transform the mood of an army, turning fear into courage. Food was not only fuel, but also a form of leadership, a way to bind men together and inspire loyalty. After battle, food took on a different tone. Survivors ate with relief, often devouring whatever remained in silence or exhausted laughter. But before battle, breakfast was always tinged with uncertainty. Every bite might be the last, every sip a farewell. To sit with comrades, breaking bread in the pale light of morning, was to share not only food, but also fate. In those moments, the simple act of eating became a bond, one that carried men forward into the unknown. So when we picture breakfast on the battlefield, we should not imagine abundance or leisure. We should imagine crusts of bread softened in ale, wedges of hard cheese, bowls of thin stew steaming in the cold air. We should imagine men gathered around fires, their faces lit by both flame and fear, eating quickly as horses snorted and commanders shouted. We should imagine the weight of hunger mingled with the weight of destiny, for no one knew if the sun that rose on that morning would also rise on them again. Breakfast on the battlefield was not about taste or ceremony. It was about strength, about courage, about the fragile line between life and death. And in its simplicity, it reminds us that even in war, even in moments of terror and uncertainty, men still needed to eat. Bread, cheese, ale, ordinary foods that became extraordinary when consumed beneath the shadow of battle. If bread was the foundation of the medieval morning meal, drink was its companion. To imagine breakfast in the Middle Ages without something to sip is to imagine it incomplete. Whether one was a peasant rising in a damp cottage, a monk leaving the chapel after early prayers, or a noble in a castle chamber, the morning drink was as essential as the food itself. Yet, as with everything in this age, what filled the cup varied greatly, depending on class, region, and circumstance. Some drinks were common to all, while others marked wealth, privilege, or learning. Together, they paint a picture of mornings not only shaped by hunger, but also by thirst. The most universal drink was ale. Brewed everywhere from village cottages to town breweries, Ale was the lifeblood of medieval Europe. It was weak in alcohol compared to later beers, often called small beer, but it was nourishing and most importantly safe. Water could not always be trusted. Streams carried disease, wells could be fouled, and stagnant water posed risks that people did not fully understand, but certainly recognized. Ale, by contrast, was boiled in the brewing process, making it safer to drink. Its mild fermentation preserved it, and its calories provided strength. Children drank it, the elderly drank it, and everyone in between began their day with it. In the morning, ale was sometimes drunk alone, sometimes used to soften hard bread. A crust dipped in ale became more edible, and the drink itself calmed the stomach after a night of emptiness. For peasants, a mug of ale might be the first and sometimes the only thing consumed before work. For laborers in towns, it steadied the hands before long hours of craft. Even in monasteries, where rules restricted indulgence, ale was often allowed, for it was seen less as luxury and more as necessity. Its ubiquity makes it the truest drink of the medieval morning. In regions where vineyards flourished, wine held the same role that ale did elsewhere. France, Italy, and Spain were lands where grapevines stretched across hillsides, and wine was abundant enough to reach nearly every table. In the morning, people often drank it watered down, a practice meant both to stretch supplies and to make it lighter for daily use. Bread was dipped into wine, children sipped diluted portions, and nobles drank stronger vintages flavored with herbs or spices. To begin the day with wine was as ordinary in these regions as beginning the day with ale was in England or the Low Countries. Among the wealthy, wine took on another dimension. It was not only sustenance, but also display. Imported wines from distant regions, carefully stored and aged, were presented at morning tables to guests, even when simpler local wines might have sufficed. Spiced wines, known as hippocras, were thought to aid digestion and health, making them acceptable even at dawn. Cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and nutmeg transformed ordinary wine into something exotic, each sip a reminder of the household's wealth and reach. To drink such a beverage in the morning was to declare one's place among the privileged few. Other drinks filled the mornings of medieval people as well. Milk, though less common than we might expect, was present, especially for children. Cows and goats produced milk, but much of it was turned quickly into butter or cheese, which lasted longer. Still, in summer when milk was plentiful, children often drank it fresh, and the elderly, who struggled with hard foods, sometimes received it as a gentle form of nourishment. Warm milk might be taken in the morning, though it was not the daily habit it would later become. For many, milk was a food to be transformed, not a drink to be consumed as it was. Herbal infusions also appeared in the mornings, especially within monastic communities. Long before coffee and tea reached Europe, monks and healers brewed herbs in hot water, creating drinks that were part medicine, part refreshment. Chamomile, mint, sage, and other local herbs were steeped for their soothing properties. These were not everyday drinks for all people, but were known in certain regions and contexts. For the sick, a cup of warm herbal water could be a comfort at dawn, easing illness or weakness. For the healthy, it was a rare alternative to ale or wine, carrying with it a sense of healing and care. In northern regions, mead sometimes appeared at the morning table. Made from fermented honey, mead was both sweet and warming. It was less common than ale, for honey was valuable and often reserved for trade or medicine. But where it was made, it could be consumed in small amounts. To drink mead in the morning was likely more a matter of special occasion than daily habit. But its presence reminds us that medieval people had more variety than we sometimes assume. Water, though often unsafe, was not entirely absent. People did drink it, especially from trusted wells or springs. In some monasteries, water was preferred as a form of restraint, and in remote villages, people drew from sources they knew to be clean. Still, water alone was rarely the central drink of breakfast. It lacked the calories and perceived safety of ale or wine, and so it was often the last choice rather than the first. The role of drink in the morning was not only practical, but also social. To share a mug of ale with a fellow worker before heading into the fields, to dip bread together into a jug of wine, to pass a flask among soldiers at dawn, these were acts of community. Drink bound people together, just as food did. In noble households, servants poured wine or ale into goblets, creating rituals of hierarchy and service. In cottages, family members shared from the same mug, passing it hand to hand in the dim light of morning. These moments carried meaning, shaping the rhythm of the day and the bonds between people. For all classes, the morning drink was both nourishment and comfort. It steadied the body, warmed the spirit, and gave a sense of beginning. Even when food was scarce, a sip of ale or wine could quiet the stomach and provide the courage to face the hours ahead. The taste was familiar, repeated day after day, tying people to the land and to one another. When coffee and tea eventually arrived in Europe, they transformed the morning table, creating entirely new rituals of breakfast. But in the Middle Ages, before such imports were known, the drinks of dawn were simpler, rooted in the local and the practical. Ale, wine, milk, mead, and herbs. These were the companions of bread and cheese, shaping mornings across centuries. To imagine a medieval morning without them is impossible. The peasant sipping ale before walking into the fields, the monk drinking a small cup of water flavored with mint. The noble savoring spiced wine in a gilded cup all found comfort in drink at dawn. It was not only fuel for the body, but also a thread in the fabric of medieval life, woven into every cottage, monastery, and hall. And in this way, the story of breakfast in the Middle Ages is also the story of what filled the cup, steadying the hand and the heart at the start of each day. Not every morning in the Middle Ages began with bread, cheese, or ale. For many, the first hours of the day unfolded with nothing to eat or drink at all. Forgotten breakfasts were not unusual. They were woven into the fabric of daily life, sometimes by choice, more often by necessity. To us, the idea of beginning the day without food feels strange, even unhealthy. But to medieval men and women, it was ordinary, expected, and at times even virtuous. Hunger in the morning was simply another companion, no less present than the rooster's crow or the rising sun. One of the main reasons breakfast was so often skipped lay in religion. The teachings of the Church stressed fasting, discipline, and the suspicion of gluttony. To eat too early was seen as indulgent, a sign that the body ruled the spirit rather than the other way around. Monks were expected to abstain until mid-morning, and their example influenced society at large. In many towns and villages, people were encouraged to wait until after Mass before breaking their fast. This meant that entire communities began their days with empty stomachs, their hunger endured as part of spiritual discipline. Yet religion was not the only reason breakfasts vanished. Poverty played an even greater role. For peasants and laborers, food was scarce and had to be rationed carefully. Grain, cheese, and meat were precious, and the first priority was often to save enough for the main meal at midday, when families could gather and eat together. To consume food in the early morning might mean less at noon, when energy was most needed for long hours of work. In this way, many chose or were forced to ignore their morning hunger, saving their limited provisions for later. Forgotten breakfasts were a matter of survival as much as piety. In times of famine, the absence of breakfast became even sharper. Crop failures, harsh winters, or wars that disrupted trade often left households with little more than scraps. Chronicles from the Middle Ages describe years when bread itself was scarce, when families survived on roots, acorns, or bark, and when hunger stretched from morning into night. In such times, breakfast was not merely forgotten, it was impossible. Days began with empty stomachs, and they often ended the same way. The absence of a morning meal was not a choice, but a reflection of the fragility of life in a world so close to the edge of starvation. For laborers, working without breakfast was an act of endurance. Farmers plowed fields on nothing but determination. Shepherds drove flocks with empty bellies, and masons lifted stone after stone without having eaten since the night before. Hunger made the work harder, but it was endured as part of life. In some households, a small pause came mid-morning, when a crust of bread or a sip of ale might be taken in the fields, but by modern standards, this was hardly a meal. It was a makeshift solution, a compromise between hunger and scarcity. Children, too, often went without in the morning. Parents might save food for midday or evening, when the family could eat together. A child's cries for food at dawn might be quieted with a sip of ale or water, but not with a full meal. This was not neglect, but necessity, for food had to be stretched as far as possible. Childhood hunger was part of life, teaching resilience and patience, even if it also stunted growth and weakened health. For elders, the absence of breakfast could be especially harsh. Weakened bodies needed nourishment, but in poor households, the needs of the young and the working adults came first. Elders sometimes ate last, and sometimes not at all. Their mornings were often marked by silence and hunger. Forgotten breakfasts were also a feature of travel. Pilgrims walking long roads might begin their day with nothing, waiting until they reached the next town or monastery to find food. Merchants on the move sometimes pressed ahead without stopping, eager to cover ground before the heat of the day. Soldiers on campaign often woke to hunger, especially when supply lines failed. In all these cases, the absence of breakfast was not unusual but expected. Hunger accompanied the road, just as surely as dust and blisters did. And yet, in this regularity of hunger, there was a kind of acceptance. Medieval people did not view the absence of breakfast with alarm. It was not thought of as unhealthy or dangerous, but as ordinary. The body was expected to endure, to wait until the proper time for food. Hunger was not something to be immediately satisfied, but something to be lived with, managed, and often spiritualized. To be hungry in the morning was not failure. It was life. Forgotten breakfasts also carried meaning in the rhythm of the year. In Lent and on fasting days, the absence of morning food was deliberate, part of a shared act of devotion. Whole communities refrained from eating until later, creating a collective hunger that reinforced religious identity. On feast days, by contrast, the sudden appearance of food in the morning felt all the more joyful, precisely because it was so rare. Hunger gave meaning to indulgence, and forgotten breakfasts made the rare remembered ones all the sweeter. For the wealthy, the absence of breakfast was sometimes a matter of fashion. Nobles and courtiers could afford to eat in the morning, but many chose not to, in order to demonstrate restraint and refinement. To avoid food until later in the day was seen as noble, a sign of self-control. Eating too early could be associated with greed or with the rough habits of peasants. Thus, forgotten breakfasts became not only a reality of poverty, but also a statement of privilege. The difference lay in choice. Peasants went without because they had no food. Nobles went without because they wished to appear virtuous. Both began their days in hunger, but for very different reasons. This pattern of empty mornings shaped the very language of food. The word breakfast itself did not come into common English use until the later Middle Ages. And even then, it referred simply to the breaking of the nightly fast, not to a structured meal at dawn. The assumption was that the fast lasted longer than the hours of sleep, stretching into the morning. To break it too soon was unusual, worthy of being named. The absence of breakfast, therefore, was not strange to them. It was the default. If we close our eyes and imagine a medieval village at dawn, we might see smoke rising from chimneys, fields beginning to stir with workers, and children rubbing sleep from their eyes. And yet, many of these people would not be eating. Their stomachs would be empty, their bodies moving forward with only the promise of the midday meal to come. Hunger hung in the air, unspoken but shared. It was not seen as tragedy, but as part of the rhythm of life. So when we think of medieval breakfasts, we must remember not only what was eaten, but also what was not. Forgotten breakfasts tell us as much about the Middle Ages as lavish noble tables or humble peasant meals. They remind us of the fragility of food supply, the influence of faith, the endurance of laborers, and the quiet acceptance of hunger. They remind us that the medieval morning was not always filled with taste and comfort, but often with silence and emptiness. And yet, within this emptiness lay resilience. People endured, worked, prayed, and lived through hungry mornings, carrying themselves forward until food could be found. Forgotten breakfasts were not failures, but realities. They were the other side of the medieval morning, the side that teaches us how much strength it took to live in a world where food was never guaranteed, and where hunger was a companion from the first light of day. When we think of breakfast today, it is hard not to bring modern assumptions with us. We are told that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, that everyone in the past surely ate something upon waking, and that the absence of food in the morning was strange or unhealthy. Yet many of these ideas are myths, created by later centuries and applied backward to times that thought very differently about food. To understand medieval breakfast, we must carefully separate modern notions from the reality of the past, for the truth is often more surprising and more revealing than the stories we like to imagine. Perhaps the greatest misconception is that medieval people always ate 3 meals a day: breakfast, lunch, and dinner, just as we do. In truth, the 3-meal system is a modern habit, solidified much later. In the Middle Ages, people often ate only 2 meals, one at midday and one in the evening. The morning was not always marked by a structured meal, and many lived comfortably, or at least habitually, without it. To medieval people, this was normal. They did not see the lack of a morning meal as deprivation, but as part of the ordinary rhythm of life. Our insistence that breakfast must exist each day simply does not align with their world. Another myth is the idea that medieval breakfasts were hearty, filling spreads of meat, eggs, bread, and ale for everyone, every day. While such meals existed for nobles or on special occasions, they were far from the norm. For peasants, the morning was often empty, or marked by a crust of bread and a sip of ale. For monks, it was delayed until prayers were complete. For nobles, it might be richer, but it was still often restrained, especially in comparison to the midday feast. The vision of everyone sitting down to a large breakfast each morning is largely a projection of later centuries, when breakfast grew in cultural importance. We also sometimes imagine that medieval people did not understand nutrition, that they ignored the needs of their bodies and lived in ignorance about hunger. This, too, is misleading. They did not use the same language of vitamins or calories, but they understood that food gave strength, that work required fuel, and that hunger weakened the body. They knew that children and elders needed softer or gentler foods, that laborers needed more sustenance, and that fasting tested endurance. What shaped their choices was not ignorance, but necessity, custom, and faith. They ate when food was available, when rules allowed it, and when their bodies demanded it. Breakfast, or the absence of it, was part of this broader understanding of balance. Another misconception lies in the idea that people were always malnourished because of skipping breakfast. While hunger was certainly common, the absence of a morning meal did not always mean starvation. Many people ate heartily at midday and in the evening, enough to sustain themselves through the day. Their bodies were accustomed to longer stretches without food, and their concept of nourishment was not bound to a rigid schedule. They knew hunger well, but they also knew how to live with it, shaping their habits around the realities of life. We might also think of breakfast foods as fixed categories: bread, porridge, eggs, fruits, but in the Middle Ages, what appeared in the morning was often whatever was available. Leftovers from the previous night were common, especially in noble households. Pottage, stews, or roasted meats were eaten cold in the morning. In poorer homes, bread and ale might be the only options, but even then, variations appeared depending on the season, the harvest, and the region. The myth of traditional breakfast foods is a modern invention tied to later marketing and cultural habits. Medieval people did not think in such categories. They simply ate what they had. A further misconception is the belief that breakfast was equally important to all medieval people. In reality, attitudes varied widely. Monks saw it as unnecessary or even suspect, preferring to fast until later. Nobles treated it as optional, sometimes indulging, sometimes refraining. Peasants took it when they could, skipped it when they could not. Children and elders often received special allowances, while laborers might eat early if their work required it. Breakfast was not a single practice, but a spectrum, shaped by need, faith, and circumstance. To say that medieval people did or did not eat breakfast is too simple. The truth was far more fluid. There is also the enduring image of medieval indulgence lords and ladies feasting constantly, including at breakfast. While nobles certainly had more access to luxuries, they were not always extravagant in the morning. Many were cautious, aware of the church's warnings against gluttony. When they did indulge, it was often for show, when guests were present, or when feasts required display. The idea of daily indulgent breakfasts for the wealthy overlooks the balance they tried to maintain between privilege and piety. Their tables could be rich, yes, but they were also tempered by restraint. Another myth is that breakfast as we know it today is timeless. In truth, the very idea that breakfast is the most important meal of the day is modern, born of changing work habits, medical theories, and even marketing by food companies. Medieval people did not place such importance on the morning meal. To them, it was optional, and often secondary to prayer or labor. The central meals of the day were midday and evening, not dawn. To project our modern emphasis on breakfast backward is to misunderstand how medieval people ordered their lives. It is also a misconception to think that people saw hunger only as a negative. Hunger was sometimes embraced, especially in religious contexts, as a form of discipline and devotion. To endure hunger in the morning was to imitate the saints, to purify the body, and to remind oneself of spiritual priorities. Fasting was not seen as neglect, but as virtue, and the absence of breakfast could be understood not as a lack, but as an offering. In this way, what we view as deprivation they sometimes viewed as strength. Finally, there is the myth that the medieval world was static, unchanging in its practices. In reality, attitudes toward breakfast evolved. By the later Middle Ages, breakfast was becoming more accepted, especially in towns and cities where work began early and demanded fuel. Merchants, students, and craftsmen increasingly saw the need for morning food, and the suspicion surrounding it began to fade. What was once seen as indulgence became more normalized, setting the stage for the breakfast culture that developed in later centuries. So the myths of medieval breakfast reveal more about us than about them. They show how we project our own habits and values onto the past, imagining it as a mirror of the present. The reality is more complex. Mornings of hunger, mornings of bread and ale, mornings of luxury, mornings of fasting. To the medieval mind, breakfast was not the anchor of the day, but a negotiable moment, shaped by circumstance. To us, the absence of breakfast feels strange. To them, it was ordinary. By unraveling these misconceptions, we gain a clearer picture of their lives. We see how they endured hunger with patience, how they celebrated feasts with joy, how they adapted to scarcity with resilience. We see how breakfast, or the lack of it, was never a simple matter, but always tied to faith, survival, and social order. And in this understanding, the medieval morning becomes more vivid, not as a reflection of our own world, but as a world entirely its own. The story of breakfast in the Middle Ages is one of simplicity, scarcity, and restraint. Bread, cheese, and ale formed the backbone of the morning table, with variations depending on class, season, and region. For many, mornings began with nothing at all, shaped by necessity or religious discipline. Yet history is never still, and as the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance and beyond, the meaning of breakfast began to change. Slowly, across centuries, the morning meal evolved from a doubtful indulgence into the central ritual we know today. One of the most important forces in this transformation was trade. In the later Middle Ages, Europe's connections to distant lands expanded. Merchant ships sailed from Italian ports to the eastern Mediterranean. Caravans carried spices across deserts, and markets in towns grew filled with goods from far beyond local fields. With these new connections came new flavors, sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, luxuries at first, but slowly becoming more familiar. At noble tables, even in the morning, these spices began to appear, sprinkled into wine or stirred into porridges. Their presence made breakfast more enticing, more worthy of attention, and helped shift attitudes toward eating at dawn. Another great force was colonial exploration. By the 16th and 17th centuries, new foods entered Europe that would forever alter the morning table. Coffee arrived from the Ottoman world, tea from China, and chocolate from the Americas. At first, these drinks were novelties, consumed by the wealthy in courts and cities. But their stimulating qualities, sharp, bitter, awakening, made them especially suited to the morning. Slowly, across generations, they displaced the ale and wine of medieval breakfasts. The warm, invigorating cups of coffee and tea gave people new reasons to gather in the morning, and with them, breakfast began to assume a new role as a daily ritual. Alongside these beverages came new foods. The potato, though at first distrusted, spread across Europe, offering a cheap and filling staple. Maize and other crops from the New World altered diets as well. Sugar became more common, no longer limited to the richest households. With it came sweet pastries, jams, and confections that brightened the morning. Breakfast, once plain and practical, became sweeter, richer, and more varied. Urban life also shaped this transformation. In medieval villages, work began at dawn, and meals were tied to the rhythm of the fields. But as towns and cities grew, the schedules of artisans, merchants, and students demanded something different. Work in workshops, schools, and shops often began earlier, and the need for a morning meal grew stronger. Students at universities were among the first to normalize breakfast, gathering for bread, cheese, and ale before lectures. Merchants, too, found that early food gave them the strength to manage long days of trade. Gradually, breakfast shed its suspicion of indulgence and took its place as an expected part of daily life. The Reformation and changing religious practices also influenced the morning meal. While fasting remained important, attitudes toward eating in the morning softened. In Protestant regions especially, the suspicion that breakfast was sinful began to fade. Eating early was seen less as indulgence and more as practicality. Combined with the spread of coffee houses in the 17th century, breakfast became not only acceptable but fashionable. In cities like London, Paris, and Amsterdam, people gathered in the morning to drink coffee, read pamphlets, discuss politics, and exchange news. Breakfast was no longer just a private act of survival. It was becoming a public ritual, shaping culture and society. By the 18th century, breakfast had transformed almost entirely from its medieval roots. In noble households, it became a daily ritual, often featuring coffee, chocolate, or tea, along with pastries, bread, butter, and fruits. For the middle classes, it became an expected start to the day, eaten before work or study. Even for the poor, while hunger still haunted many mornings, the idea that breakfast should exist was more firmly established than it had been in the Middle Ages. The rise of industry in the 19th century completed the transformation. With workers laboring in factories from early hours, breakfast became essential. Employers recognized the need for a fed workforce, and households increasingly prioritized the morning meal. Porridge, bread, tea, and later new inventions like cereal filled breakfast tables. What had once been uncertain or optional in the Middle Ages became, in the modern world, the meal that set the rhythm of the day. Looking back, the transition from medieval breakfasts to modern ones shows us how culture, economy, religion, and trade intertwine. The medieval morning was cautious, often empty, shaped by scarcity and suspicion. But as Europe expanded outward, as new foods and drinks arrived, and as work and society changed, breakfast transformed. The ale and bread of the medieval cottage gave way to the coffee and pastries of the modern cafe. The silence of monastic fasting gave way to the bustle of coffeehouses, filled with talk and debate. What was once forgotten became central, and what was once humble became elaborate. And yet, the echoes of the medieval morning still remain. Bread continues to be central, whether in toast, rolls, or croissants. Cheese and butter still accompany it. Porridge, though now sweetened and softened, remains a staple in many cultures. Even the idea of fasting lingers, as people experiment once again with delaying food for health or discipline. The medieval suspicion of breakfast has not disappeared entirely. It has only shifted into new forms. So the transition to modern breakfasts is not only a story of change, but also of continuity. The foods may differ, the drinks may have transformed, but the basic human need remains the same: to rise, to face the day, and to find strength in the first meal, whether large or small. The medieval morning, with its bread, ale, and silences, may seem distant, but it laid the foundation for the rituals we know today. Without their rhythms of fasting and feasting, without their resilience in hunger, without their eventual acceptance of early meals, our own breakfasts would not be what they are. And so, when we sip coffee or tea in the morning, when we spread butter on bread, or eat porridge sweetened with sugar, we are participating in a story that stretches back centuries. We are heirs to the medieval mornings, to their forgotten breakfasts and their simple meals, to their moments of discipline and their moments of joy. The transition to modern breakfasts was slow, shaped by forces far larger than food alone, but its outcome is with us every day in the quiet comfort of our first meal. And so, we come to the end of our journey through the mornings of the Middle Ages. Together, we have wandered through cottages and castles, monasteries and marketplaces, battlefields and pilgrimage roads. We have seen how the first meal of the day was shaped not only by hunger, but by faith, by labor, by wealth, by season, and by region. Some mornings were marked by abundance: spiced wine, sugared fruits, or roasted meats. Others were marked by silence and emptiness, when there was nothing but hunger to carry people forward. We have discovered that breakfast was not the universal ritual it is today. For peasants, it was often forgotten or delayed: a crust of bread and a sip of ale to quiet the stomach before hours of toil. For nobles, it could be restrained, or it could be luxurious, depending on the day and the guests at hand. For monks, it was bound tightly to prayer and fasting, allowed only as discipline required. For children, it might be softened with milk or sweetened with honey. For the elderly, warmed into broths to ease frailty. Soldiers on campaign clutched bread and cheese in the cold dawn, while travelers on long roads relied on charity or what little they carried. Across all these stories, we see a pattern of endurance, resilience, and adaptation. We have also seen how religion shaped every mouthful. The Church's suspicion of early eating meant that breakfast was often treated with caution. Fasting gave hunger spiritual meaning, while feast days transformed mornings into rare occasions of joy. Forgotten breakfasts, so common in that age, remind us of the closeness of scarcity and the patience with which hunger was endured. And yet, as time passed, change arrived. Trade brought sugar and spices. Exploration brought coffee, tea, and chocolate. Slowly, the morning transformed, and what was once doubtful became celebrated. Breakfast grew into the meal we know today, central to the rhythm of modern life. In all of this, one thing stands out. The medieval morning was never only about food. It was about survival, discipline, and community. To share bread and ale in the dawn light was to share not only nourishment, but also life itself. To endure hunger together was as meaningful as to feast together. And in this way, breakfast in the Middle Ages becomes a window into the hearts of those who lived then, showing us how they faced each day with the strength they had, whatever form it took. If you've listened this far, thank you for joining me on this long, gentle journey. I hope the steady rhythm of these stories has helped you relax, rest, or drift into sleep. If you enjoyed this exploration of history, told slowly and softly, I invite you to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story. And in the comments, let me know when you listen. Do you drift off to these stories at night, or play them during the day as a way to unwind? I'd also love to hear what moments in history interest you most, so we can bring them to life together in future videos. Until then, may your mornings be peaceful, your evenings restful, and your dreams filled with the echoes of history. Good night.